Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a man born into a crowded household, with little money, few connections, and no formal schooling could quietly shape the language of liberty, the habits of science, and the practical workings of an entire nation without ever trying to be its ruler? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, feel free to share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Benjamin Franklin entered the world in Boston in January of 1706, at a time when the city was still a tight cluster of wooden buildings pressed between the sea and the forest. Fires were common, winters were long, and opportunity was unevenly distributed. He was the 15th child in a family of 17, born to a candle maker whose trade was honest but modest. In such a household, individuality did not announce itself loudly. It learned to wait, to observe, and to adapt. From an early age, Franklin showed a steady curiosity rather than a dramatic brilliance. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how adults reasoned, argued, and persuaded. Formal schooling lasted only briefly, ending when he was 10, not because of failure, but because the family needed another pair of working hands. Learning, however, did not stop. It simply shifted location. Books became his teachers, borrowed when possible, purchased when money allowed, and read late into the night by candlelight candles his father often made. Boston, in Franklin's youth, was a deeply religious and socially ordered place. Authority flowed downward from church leaders, magistrates, and respected elders. Questioning was tolerated only within narrow boundaries. Franklin absorbed this environment carefully. He did not rebel openly, but he quietly tested ideas in his own mind, weighing tradition against reason. This habit, measured, patient, and self-directed, would stay with him for life. At 12, Franklin was apprenticed to his older brother James, a printer. Printing was one of the few trades where ideas and labour mixed daily. Ink stained the hands, but it also carried arguments, news, satire, and dissent. The print shop was noisy, busy, and full of opinions. Franklin learned to set type, operate presses, and correct errors, but he also learned how words could travel beyond their author and take on lives of their own. James Franklin was not an easy master. He was strict, sometimes harsh, and not inclined to encourage a younger brother's independence. Yet, the shop exposed Benjamin to pamphlets, essays, and imported writings from England that questioned authority and explored science, philosophy, and politics. Franklin read everything he could find. He studied how sentences were built, how arguments were paced, and how humour could soften difficult truths. It was during these years that Franklin began experimenting quietly with writing. Unable to publish under his own name, he adopted a persona, slipping anonymous letters under the print shop door at night. These pieces were observant, witty, and restrained. They did not shout, they reasoned. When readers praised them, James printed them, unaware at first of their true author. The experience taught Franklin an early lesson. Ideas carried more weight when detached from ego. The relationship between the brothers deteriorated over time. Disagreements hardened. Discipline became resentment. In colonial society, apprentices were legally bound, and escape was both risky and frowned upon. Yet Franklin's temperament favoured movement over stagnation. At 17, with little money and no formal release, he left Boston quietly and headed south. The journey to Philadelphia was uncomfortable and uncertain. He travelled by boat and on foot, arriving tired, poorly dressed, and carrying little more than a roll of bread. Philadelphia, however, felt different from Boston. It was more diverse, more commercially driven, and less rigid in its social hierarchy. Here, skill and reliability mattered more than family background. Franklin found work as a printer's assistant and quickly distinguished himself through diligence and calm competence. He did not rush to impress. He listened, learned local customs, and observed which qualities earned trust. The city was growing, and with growth came opportunity, not sudden wealth, but steady advancement. His habits during this period were deliberate. He rose early, planned his days, and kept careful track of expenses. These were not grand moral gestures, but practical adjustments to uncertainty. Franklin understood that independence was built through consistency rather than dramatic gestures. Philadelphia also exposed Franklin to a broader range of people and ideas. Merchants, craftsmen, Quakers, immigrants, and intellectuals crossed paths regularly. The exchange of views felt more open, less constrained by inherited authority. Franklin found this environment suited his temperament. He was not seeking to overturn society, but to understand how it worked and how it might work better. An unexpected opportunity soon took him to London, where he hoped to acquire better equipment for a printing business promised by a patron who failed to deliver. Stranded but resourceful, Franklin found work in British print shops. London was larger, louder, and more stratified than Philadelphia. It offered access to books, scientific discussions, and intellectual circles that widened Franklin's perspective. Yet London also revealed the distance between promise and practice in the empire. Franklin observed class divisions more starkly and noted how opportunity narrowed as hierarchy solidified. He learned, without bitterness, that systems often favored tradition over talent. After nearly 2 years, Franklin returned to Philadelphia, more experienced and more cautious. He resumed printing work and gradually moved toward independence. With partners and borrowed funds, he established his own shop. Success came slowly. He reinvested profits, maintained quality, and cultivated reliability rather than novelty. During these early adult years, Franklin began shaping the public persona that would later make him widely known. He did not present himself as exceptional. Instead, he emphasized usefulness. His writing addressed everyday concerns, work habits, thrift, cooperation, and shared responsibility. These themes resonated in a colonial society built on mutual dependence. Franklin also began organizing informal discussion groups, bringing together tradesmen and thinkers to exchange ideas. These gatherings were practical in tone, focused on self-improvement and civic contribution rather than abstract philosophy. From them emerged projects like lending libraries and volunteer associations, small but meaningful steps toward collective advancement. Throughout this period, Franklin remained careful with ambition. He observed how overreaching damaged reputations and how patience often yielded better results. He avoided personal feuds, spoke cautiously in public, and preferred persuasion over confrontation. By the end of this opening chapter of his life, Franklin was no revolutionary figure, no grand theorist, and no celebrated thinker. He was a skilled printer, a thoughtful observer, and a steadily rising participant in colonial society. The foundations of his later influence were already in place not through force or drama, but through habits of attention, restraint, and quiet improvement. Runaway to Philadelphia. Franklin's quiet departure from Boston did not feel, at the time, like the beginning of a legend. It felt more like a practical decision made under pressure, with limited options and no certainty of success. Apprenticeship laws bound young men tightly, and running away carried real consequences, yet remaining meant continued conflict, stalled growth, and a narrowing future. Franklin chose movement not out of defiance, but out of calculation. He believed that skill, once removed from constraint, could find its own place. The journey south was uncomfortable and unplanned. Franklin travelled first by boat along the coast, then on foot through unfamiliar towns. Money ran low quickly. Food was simple and sometimes scarce. Clothing wore thin. These details mattered because they shaped his understanding of independence. Freedom, he learned early, did not arrive with comfort. It arrived with uncertainty and responsibility. There was no romance in this realization, only clarity. When Franklin reached Philadelphia, he did so quietly, without introductions or recommendations. He arrived on a Sunday morning, tired and hungry, holding a few coins and carrying bread under his arm. The city was still waking. Church bells rang, streets were calm. This moment, often retold later with humor, was not grand. It was simply the starting point of a long process of adjustment. Philadelphia differed from Boston in subtle but important ways. Founded on principles of tolerance and commerce, it lacked some of the rigid social structures Franklin had known. Religious diversity was visible. Quakers, Lutherans, Anglicans, and others shared space without constant friction. Authority existed, but it was quieter, less performative. For someone attentive to atmosphere, this mattered. Franklin quickly sought work. Printing shops were few, but his experience gave him an advantage. He found employment and settled into routine. Once again, he learned more than the mechanical aspects of the trade. He studied how customers behaved, how business relationships were built, and how trust developed over time. Reliability, he noticed, was valued above flair. His personal habits during this period were carefully maintained. He avoided excess, spent cautiously, and observed how others managed success and failure. Franklin did not chase social standing. He watched it. He noted which behaviors earned respect and which invited quiet exclusion. These observations fed into a developing philosophy grounded not in ideals, but in outcomes. Philadelphia also introduced Franklin to the idea that knowledge could circulate more freely. Coffee houses, meeting halls, and informal gatherings allowed discussion without rigid hierarchy. Franklin listened more than he spoke, learning how disagreement could exist without hostility. This reinforced his preference for moderation and patience. An early setback came when a promised opportunity to advance his printing career failed to materialize. A potential patron offered support and equipment but proved unreliable. Rather than confront or complain, Franklin adapted. When the chance arose to travel to London to secure resources directly, he accepted, seeing value in experience even when circumstances were imperfect. London exposed Franklin to the heart of the empire. The scale of the city was overwhelming. Print shops operated at a different pace, serving a broader and more demanding public. Here, Franklin refined his technical skills and absorbed the rhythms of a larger market. He also observed the sharper edges of social division. Advancement was possible, but more constrained. Reputation mattered deeply, and class boundaries were harder to cross. Franklin did not thrive in London financially, but he learned. He read widely, attended lectures, and met individuals engaged in scientific and philosophical inquiry. These encounters expanded his sense of what knowledge could accomplish when pursued methodically and shared openly. At the same time, he became more aware of the distance between imperial ideals and everyday realities. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia, he did so with tempered expectations and a stronger sense of self-direction. He no longer relied on promises, he relied on preparation. Resuming work, he focused on building independence gradually. Partnerships were chosen carefully, investments were cautious, reputation was guarded. This period marked a shift in Franklin's character. He moved from youthful restlessness to deliberate construction. He understood now that progress was cumulative. Each decision, however small, contributed to long-term stability. There was no hurry. There was only forward motion. Franklin also began thinking more intentionally about how individuals improved themselves within communities. Personal success, he concluded, was inseparable from civic health. A city that functioned well created space for individuals to advance. In turn, individuals who acted responsibly strengthened the city. By the end of this phase, Franklin was no longer simply a runaway apprentice. He was an emerging craftsman with a clear sense of direction. He had tested independence, absorbed failure without resentment, and learned to navigate complexity without urgency. These qualities, formed quietly during uncertain years, would later allow him to move comfortably among printers and philosophers, merchants and ministers, citizens and kings, ink, ideas, and ambition. By the time Benjamin Franklin settled again into Philadelphia life, he had reached an age when many men of his era were already fixed in their roles. Trades were inherited or locked in early, reputations established young, habits hardened by necessity. Franklin, however, was only beginning to assemble the elements that would define him. The years immediately following his return from London were not dramatic, but they were decisive. They formed the bridge between survival and influence, between skill and voice. Franklin returned with little money and no powerful patron, yet he carried something more durable, a refined understanding of how the world of print operated at scale. London had shown him both the possibilities and the limitations of ambition. He had seen talented men stall because of class barriers, and others advance simply by managing impressions well. From this, Franklin drew a quiet conclusion that would guide him for decades. success did not require brilliance alone. It required steadiness, adaptability, and an awareness of how one's work fit into the needs of others. Back in Philadelphia, he resumed work as a printer's journeyman. The city had grown slightly in his absence, and competition among printers was increasing. Franklin paid close attention to quality. He noticed uneven type, careless spelling, rushed layouts in rival shops. Rather than criticize openly, he resolved to let precision speak for itself. He was methodical in setting type, careful with spacing, and attentive to legibility. These details were not glamorous, but they built trust with customers who depended on printed material to represent their own reputations. Franklin soon entered a partnership to establish his own printing business. The arrangement was modest and financially risky. Supplies were costly, credit was limited, and profit margins were thin. Franklin compensated by controlling expenses tightly and expanding services gradually. He printed pamphlets, broadsides, government documents, and small books, whatever steady work could be secured. There was no immediate breakthrough, only incremental progress. During this time, Franklin began to understand printing not merely as a trade, but as a platform. Every sheet of paper that left his shop carried ideas into homes, taverns, and meeting halls. What people read shaped how they spoke, argued, and imagined their place in the world. Franklin did not see this power as something to wield aggressively. Instead, he treated it as a responsibility to be managed carefully. He began writing more regularly, often anonymously or under pseudonyms. This distance between author and identity allowed him to test ideas without risking personal standing. His writing was restrained, observant, and practical. He avoided lofty claims and sweeping judgments. Instead, he focused on everyday behavior, how people managed time, money, work, and relationships. Readers recognized themselves in these observations. They trusted a voice that did not lecture from above. One of Franklin's early insights was that persuasion worked best when it appeared modest. He avoided absolute statements. He presented suggestions rather than commands. This style reflected his own temperament, but it also proved effective in a society wary of authority. Colonial readers were practical people. They responded to arguments grounded in experience rather than ideology. As his shop stabilized, Franklin expanded his network. He formed relationships with merchants, lawyers, craftsmen, and local officials. These connections were not cultivated through flattery or ambition, but through reliability. Franklin delivered work on time. He honored agreements. He corrected errors without argument. Over time, this consistency positioned him as someone others felt comfortable recommending. Philadelphia's social life offered further opportunities for observation. Franklin attended gatherings where ideas circulated freely, often over meals or informal meetings. He listened carefully, noting how different professions framed problems. Merchants thought in terms of risk and return. Lawyers emphasized precedent. Clergy focused on moral consequence. Franklin absorbed these perspectives without adopting any single one fully. His strength lay in synthesis rather than allegiance. It was during these years that Franklin helped establish a discussion group devoted to mutual improvement. The group met regularly to exchange ideas, critique essays, and consider projects that might benefit the community. The tone was practical, not philosophical. Members discussed how to improve public safety, education, and access to information. From these conversations emerged initiatives that extended beyond personal advancement. One such project was the establishment of a lending library. Books were expensive and scarce. By pooling resources, members created shared access to knowledge that none could have afforded individually. Franklin understood the significance of this, not as a cultural achievement, but as an infrastructural one. Knowledge became a communal asset rather than a private luxury. This principle, quietly radical in its implications, would recur throughout his life. Franklin's writing continued to evolve. He refined his ability to blend instruction with humor, never allowing wit to overpower substance. He observed that people accepted guidance more readily when it did not threaten their dignity. His essays avoided condemning language. Instead, they suggested that improvement was within reach for anyone willing to pay attention and adjust habits. The most influential expression of this approach came through a publication that presented practical wisdom in an accessible format. Rather than positioning himself as an authority, Franklin adopted the voice of an observer who had learned through experience. The advice offered was ordinary but consistent. Manage time, avoid waste, cooperate with others, plan ahead. These messages resonated not because they were new, but because they were delivered without condescension. Franklin did not see himself as a moral reformer. He saw himself as a facilitator of useful habits. This distinction mattered. He did not claim superior virtue. He acknowledged personal shortcomings openly, treating self-improvement as an ongoing process rather than an achievement. This honesty strengthened reader trust and reinforced the sense that progress was incremental. Financial stability followed gradually. Franklin's business expanded. Contracts increased. He acquired additional presses and trained apprentices. Yet even as his income grew, he maintained modest living habits. This was not asceticism, it was strategic. Franklin understood that independence depended on flexibility, and flexibility required reserves. He avoided debt when possible and treated success as something to be maintained rather than displayed. His growing reputation brought new responsibilities. He was asked to print official documents and manage communications for local institutions. These roles deepened his understanding of governance at a practical level. Laws, regulations, and public notices were not abstract concepts. They were tools that required clarity to function. Franklin's experience as a printer taught him that poorly communicated rules created confusion and resentment, while clear ones encouraged compliance. As Franklin's influence expanded, he remained cautious about personal ambition. He avoided aligning too closely with factions. He preferred to remain useful to many rather than indispensable to one. This neutrality allowed him to move between groups and mediate disagreements without appearing self-interested. The cultural atmosphere of Philadelphia during this period supported such a role. The city valued cooperation and compromise. It was less hierarchical than older colonial centers, more open to pragmatic solutions. Franklin's temperament fit this environment naturally. He did not seek to dominate conversations, he facilitated them. Printing also kept Franklin connected to developments beyond the colonies. Imported books and correspondence exposed him to scientific inquiries and philosophical debates emerging in Europe. He read about experiments, observations, and theories with careful interest. Rather than accepting claims at face value, he considered how they might be tested or applied. This approach laid the groundwork for his later scientific work, though at this stage, curiosity remained secondary to livelihood. Despite increasing recognition, Franklin resisted self-promotion. He allowed others to speak for his work. When praised, he acknowledged contributions from partners and collaborators. This habit reduced envy and strengthened alliances. It also reinforced his belief that progress was collective. By his early 30s, Franklin had achieved something rare in colonial society: relative independence. He was not wealthy, but he was secure. More importantly, he had established a voice that readers trusted and institutions relied upon. His ambition was no longer about escape or survival. It had shifted toward sustainability and influence, exercised through service rather than command. This phase of Franklin's life illustrates a pattern that would repeat often. He advanced not by seizing moments dramatically, but by positioning himself steadily where opportunity could find him. He paid attention to systems, habits, and relationships. He avoided extremes and preferred balance. These qualities made his rise appear effortless in retrospect, though it was built through years of deliberate restraint. By the end of this section of his life, Franklin stood at an intersection. He was a printer by trade, a writer by habit, a thinker by inclination, and a civic participant by choice. He had learned how ideas moved, how trust formed, and how ambition could be tempered without being diminished. The tools he had assembled discipline, clarity, moderation, and patience were now ready to be applied beyond the print shop. Poor, Richard, and Prudence. By the time Benjamin Franklin reached his mid-30s, his life had settled into a rhythm that balanced effort with reflection. The urgency of youth had softened into deliberation. His printing business was stable, his reputation dependable, and his daily routines well established. It was at this stage, neither struggling nor yet prominent, that Franklin produced the work most closely associated with his public voice, not because it revealed something new about him, but because it distilled habits and observations he had been refining for years. The publication that would come to be known widely as Poor Richard's Almanac began as a practical venture. Almanacs were common in colonial society. They provided calendars, weather forecasts, astronomical data, and household advice. They were inexpensive, widely read, and renewed annually. For a printer, they offered a reliable source of income. Franklin approached the project with this commercial reality in mind, yet he also recognized an opportunity to speak directly to a broad audience in a consistent, familiar format. Rather than presenting himself directly, Franklin adopted a persona. The fictional voice of Poor Richard was modest, observant, and lightly humorous. This character did not claim authority. He commented on life from within it. The choice was deliberate. Franklin understood that readers were more receptive to advice when it came from a figure who appeared ordinary, even slightly self-deprecating, rather than from someone claiming superiority. The maxims that filled the almanac were short, direct, and practical. They addressed work, thrift, patience, cooperation, and foresight. None were revolutionary. Many echoed older sayings or common wisdom. What made them effective was their clarity and placement. Scattered among useful data, they appeared as gentle reminders rather than instructions. Readers encountered them while planning crops, scheduling work, or marking time. Advice embedded in routine had greater staying power. Franklin's tone was careful. He avoided moral condemnation. Instead of warning readers what would happen if they failed, he suggested what might improve if they succeeded. This subtle shift reflected his broader philosophy. He believed that most people wanted to do well, but benefited from reminders framed without judgment. Improvement, in his view, was encouraged through example and repetition, not pressure. The popularity of the almanac grew steadily. It reached farmers, tradesmen, merchants, and households across the colonies. Franklin watched its reception closely. He paid attention to which sayings were repeated, which were quoted, and which faded quickly. This feedback loop informed his understanding of public taste. He learned that brevity mattered, that humor softened instruction, and that consistency built trust. Behind the public success of Poor Richard was a private discipline Franklin maintained carefully. He structured his days around work, reading, and reflection. He tracked expenses and time, not obsessively, but attentively. These habits were not imposed rigidly. Franklin adjusted them as circumstances changed. The goal was not perfection, but awareness. During this period, Franklin also experimented with systematic self-improvement. He identified qualities he believed beneficial: industry, moderation, order, sincerity, and attempted to cultivate them one by one. This process was personal rather than performative. He did not claim mastery. He acknowledged difficulty. What mattered was the attempt, repeated steadily over time. This approach reflected Franklin's understanding of human behavior. He recognized that habits formed slowly and were reinforced through structure rather than willpower alone. By focusing on one aspect at a time, he avoided discouragement. The process mirrored his broader philosophy: incremental progress achieved through attention and patience. Franklin's growing visibility did not alter his demeanor significantly. He remained accessible, engaged in local affairs, and cautious about overextending himself. He declined some opportunities that promised prestige, but demanded alignment with specific factions. Independence, for Franklin, meant maintaining the ability to move between groups without being claimed by any one of them. The cultural atmosphere of the colonies during this time was shaped by practical concerns. Life was demanding, resources were limited, success depended on cooperation as much as individual effort. Franklin's advice resonated because it acknowledged these realities. He did not preach ambition for its own sake. He emphasized balance work paired with rest, thrift with generosity, ambition with restraint. His writing also reflected an understanding of time as a resource. In an agricultural and mercantile society, wasted time translated directly into lost opportunity. Franklin's reminders about punctuality and preparation were not abstract values, they addressed daily experience. Readers recognized their own routines in his observations. As the Almanac continued year after year, Franklin refined its content. He adjusted tone, experimented with phrasing, and observed shifts in public response. This iterative process mirrored his scientific thinking, though he did not yet apply that label to his work. He tested ideas, observed outcomes, and revised accordingly. Financially, the Almanac strengthened Franklin's position. Its success provided predictable income and allowed him to reduce his direct involvement in daily printing operations. He began delegating more responsibilities to partners and apprentices. This shift freed time for broader interests while maintaining business stability. With additional time came deeper engagement in civic projects. Franklin believed that individual improvement and community improvement were linked. He applied the same principles, incremental progress, cooperation, practicality, to public initiatives. Fire safety, street lighting, and public order became areas of focus. These were not glamorous causes, but they addressed shared vulnerabilities. Franklin's approach to civic involvement avoided confrontation. He did not frame issues as moral failings. He presented them as solvable problems. By proposing voluntary associations rather than mandates, he encouraged participation without resistance. This method reflected his understanding of persuasion, shaped by years in print. The success of Poor Richard also attracted criticism. Some viewed the emphasis on thrift and industry as overly narrow or dismissive of hardship. Franklin did not respond publicly to such critiques. He understood that no message resonated universally. His aim was usefulness, not consensus. Privately, Franklin remained aware of his own limitations. He struggled at times with consistency and restraint. He acknowledged moments of impatience and distraction. These admissions did not weaken his authority, they reinforced it. Readers trusted advice from someone who recognized imperfection as a shared condition. As Franklin's reputation spread beyond Philadelphia, he received correspondence from other colonies. Printers, readers, and civic leaders engaged with his ideas. This network expanded his awareness of regional differences and common challenges. He listened carefully, absorbing perspectives without rushing to conclusions. The Almanac years marked a transition in Franklin's life. He was no longer simply building a livelihood. He was shaping a public identity grounded in usefulness rather than charisma. His influence grew not because he demanded attention, but because his words accompanied daily life quietly and consistently. By the end of this period, Franklin had achieved something uncommon. He had become a familiar presence without becoming a commanding one. His voice was trusted not because it was loud, but because it was steady. The habits he promoted reflected those he practiced: moderation, attention, and patience. This stage of Franklin's life demonstrates how influence can emerge from restraint. By choosing practicality over display, Franklin embedded his ideas into the fabric of ordinary life. He did not seek to inspire admiration, he sought to encourage competence. In doing so, he created a legacy that extended beyond any single publication. As the Almanac continued its annual cycle, Franklin began to look outward more deliberately. His curiosity expanded beyond words and habits to the natural world itself. The discipline he had cultivated through printing and writing now prepared him for a different kind of inquiry, one that would carry his name beyond the colonies and into broader intellectual circles, a life of improvement. As Benjamin Franklin moved into his 40s, the shape of his life began to change in a way that was neither sudden nor dramatic, but quietly decisive. The years of establishing himself financially, socially, and intellectually had given him something rare in colonial society: time that was not entirely consumed by survival. He did not withdraw from work, nor did he abandon responsibility. Instead, he began to reallocate his attention, applying the same practical discipline that had served him in printing to a broader vision of improvement, personal, communal, and institutional. Franklin had long believed that individual progress and social progress were intertwined. This belief was not rooted in abstract philosophy but in observation. He had seen how reliable institutions supported individual effort, and how disciplined individuals strengthened institutions. The relationship worked both ways. Improvement, therefore, could not remain private. It had to circulate. One of the clearest expressions of this thinking was Franklin's continued involvement in organized discussion groups. These gatherings were not elite salons or exclusive societies. They were practical assemblies of tradesmen, professionals, and curious minds who shared a commitment to usefulness. The tone was deliberate. Members presented ideas not to impress, but to test. Criticism was encouraged, not as opposition, but as refinement. Franklin valued these meetings because they imposed structure on thinking. Ideas were not left vague. They had to withstand questioning. This discipline mirrored his approach to writing and business. Vague intentions produced vague outcomes. Clear proposals invited action. From these discussions emerged initiatives that addressed specific needs in Philadelphia. One concern was access to knowledge. While the lending library had already been established, its operation required ongoing attention. Books needed maintenance, selection, and fair distribution. Franklin contributed not as a director issuing commands, but as a participant willing to handle details. This willingness to engage at every level, planning and execution, earned trust and encouraged others to contribute. Education, in Franklin's view, was not solely the responsibility of formal schools. It was a shared enterprise. He supported efforts to improve instruction, especially in practical subjects. Language, arithmetic, and geography mattered because they prepared individuals to participate more effectively in economic and civic life. Franklin did not dismiss classical learning, but he questioned its exclusivity. Education, he believed, should serve living communities, not only tradition. Fire safety became another area of focus. Colonial cities were vulnerable to fire, and Philadelphia was no exception. Wooden structures, open flames, and narrow streets created constant risk. Rather than relying on reactive measures, Franklin supported the formation of volunteer fire companies. These organizations emphasized preparation, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Members trained together, maintained equipment, and responded collectively. The success of these fire companies reinforced Franklin's belief in voluntary association. People were more committed to systems they helped build. Mandates might compel compliance, but participation fostered care. This insight would later shape his approach to larger political challenges. Street lighting was another practical improvement Franklin supported. Dark streets invited accidents and crime. Installing lamps required coordination, funding, and maintenance. Franklin framed the issue not as a moral failing of the city, but as a solvable problem. He helped organize support, contributed ideas, and allowed others to take credit when projects succeeded. The goal was function, not recognition. Throughout these efforts, Franklin maintained a careful balance. He did not attempt to lead every initiative. He understood the limits of attention and the risks of overextension. Instead, he supported projects where his skills were useful and stepped back when others were better positioned to lead. This restraint preserved goodwill and prevented fatigue. Franklin's personal habits during this period reflected the same principles. He continued to track time and expenses, but with flexibility. He allowed for leisure without indulgence. Reading remained central to his routine, not as escape, but as preparation. He read scientific works, histories, and practical manuals with equal interest. Each offered different tools for understanding the world. It was also during this time that Franklin's curiosity about the natural world became more active. He had long been interested in how things worked, but now he had the means and mental space to pursue systematic inquiry. His approach was cautious. He did not rush to announce conclusions. He observed, tested, and compared results. Scientific inquiry, for Franklin, was not separate from everyday life. He did not retreat into laboratories isolated from society. His experiments were often simple and directly connected to practical questions. How did heat behave? How did air move? How did electricity manifest? These were not abstract puzzles. They related to weather, comfort, safety, and communication. Franklin corresponded with other thinkers, exchanging observations and questions. These letters were careful in tone. He presented findings tentatively, inviting verification rather than asserting authority. This humility was strategic as well as sincere. Franklin understood that credibility in science, as in civic life, depended on openness to correction. As his scientific reputation grew, Franklin remained attentive to its limits. He avoided exaggeration. He declined to speculate beyond evidence. This restraint distinguished him from others who sought attention through bold claims. Franklin preferred reliability to novelty. Meanwhile, his role in civic life continued to expand. He accepted positions that allowed him to contribute without dominating. Serving as a local official, he dealt with matters of communication, organization, and coordination. These tasks suited his temperament. They required patience, clarity, and attention to detail rather than charisma. Franklin's experience as a printer informed his understanding of governance. He knew that policies, like printed materials, were only as effective as their clarity. Ambiguous rules created confusion. Clear ones encouraged compliance. He advocated for straightforward language in public documents and practical procedures in administration. During this period, Franklin also began mentoring younger individuals. He did so informally, through example rather than instruction. He offered advice when asked, but rarely unsolicited. This approach respected autonomy and reduced resistance. It also reinforced his belief that improvement was most durable when self-directed. Financially, Franklin reached a point where continued expansion of his business was no longer his primary goal. He gradually reduced his direct involvement, delegating operations to trusted partners. This transition was planned carefully to avoid disruption. Franklin did not withdraw abruptly. He phased out responsibilities, ensuring continuity. This shift allowed him to focus more on public projects and intellectual pursuits without compromising stability. It also reflected his understanding of success as something to be managed, not accumulated endlessly. Beyond a certain point, additional wealth offered diminishing returns. Time, by contrast, became increasingly valuable. Franklin's attitude toward wealth was pragmatic. He did not reject it, nor did he idealize it. He viewed financial security as a means to independence and usefulness. Excess, he believed, risked distraction and dependency. His own lifestyle remained moderate, reflecting this philosophy. Socially, Franklin moved comfortably among different groups. He was equally at ease with tradesmen and professionals, officials, and visitors. This adaptability was not calculated flattery. It arose from genuine interest in people and an ability to listen without judgment. Franklin did not rush to impress. He allowed conversations to unfold naturally. The cultural atmosphere of the colonies during this time was slowly shifting. Economic growth brought opportunity, but also inequality. Ideas about authority, responsibility, and rights circulated more widely. Franklin observed these changes attentively. He did not yet adopt a fixed political stance. He preferred to understand conditions fully before forming conclusions. His writing during this period reflected this caution. He continued to publish practical advice, but avoided overt political argument. He believed that habits of cooperation and responsibility needed to be established before larger questions could be addressed productively. Without these foundations, political debate risked becoming destructive. Franklin's emphasis on improvement extended to himself. He continued refining his habits, adjusting routines, and acknowledging shortcomings. He did not present self-improvement as a project with an endpoint. It was an ongoing process, shaped by changing circumstances. This perspective insulated him against disappointment. Setbacks did not undermine his sense of direction. They became data points rather than failures. This resilience was not emotional detachment, but disciplined interpretation. Franklin trained himself to extract lessons rather than dwell on outcomes. By the end of this phase, Franklin had become something more than a successful printer or popular writer. He was a node within a network of improvement, connecting individuals, ideas, and institutions. His influence was not centralized, it was distributed across projects, habits, and relationships. He did not yet occupy the national or international stage. That lay ahead. But the skills required for such roles, patience, clarity, moderation, and adaptability, were already deeply embedded. Franklin had built a life structured around usefulness rather than recognition, progress rather than display. This foundation would soon be tested by new challenges that extended beyond the local. As his reputation spread and responsibilities expanded, Franklin would find himself navigating larger systems and more complex conflicts. The habits of improvement he had cultivated quietly would become essential tools in a changing political landscape. Science without spectacle. By the time Benjamin Franklin entered his late 40s, his curiosity about the natural world had matured into something steady and methodical. This was not a sudden transformation. It was the result of habits long practiced, careful observation, patient note-keeping, and a preference for modest claims supported by evidence. Franklin did not approach science as a separate calling, nor did he imagine himself a discoverer in the dramatic sense. He regarded inquiry as another form of useful work, no different in spirit from improving a printing process or organizing a civic service. The scientific culture of the 18th century was still taking shape. Formal laboratories were rare, and professional scientists scarcely existed in the modern sense. Knowledge advanced through correspondence, demonstration, and replication. Experiments were often conducted in homes, workshops, or public spaces. Franklin fit naturally into this environment. His background as a printer had trained him to value clarity, repeatability, and communication. He approached experiments the same way he approached essays, with an eye toward usefulness and understanding rather than display. Franklin's early scientific interests were wide-ranging. He paid attention to weather patterns, heat, air movement, and the behavior of materials. These were not idle curiosities. Weather affected agriculture and trade. Heat influenced comfort and fuel use. Air quality shaped health. Franklin asked practical questions first, then considered underlying causes. This order of thinking kept his work grounded. Electricity, however, soon drew his sustained attention. At the time, electricity was poorly understood and often treated as a novelty. Public demonstrations emphasized sparks and shocks, entertaining audiences but offering limited insight. Franklin observed these displays with interest but also with restraint. He sensed that beneath the spectacle lay principles that could be explored systematically. Franklin began experimenting with electrical phenomena using simple equipment. He charged glass objects, observed attraction and repulsion, and noted patterns. He recorded results carefully, distinguishing between what he observed and what he inferred. When results were unclear, he repeated experiments or modified conditions. This cautious approach prevented premature conclusions. One of Franklin's key contributions was conceptual rather than technical. He proposed that electricity was a single fluid rather than two opposing forces, a departure from prevailing theories. This idea emerged gradually from observation rather than speculation. Franklin noticed that certain behaviors were consistent across experiments when interpreted through this lens. He did not insist on the theory's correctness. He presented it as a useful framework, open to testing. Communication played a crucial role in Franklin's scientific work. He corresponded with other investigators, sharing findings and questions. His letters were clear, organized, and modest in tone. He acknowledged uncertainty and welcomed correction. This openness encouraged dialogue and replication, strengthening the collective process of discovery. Franklin's experiments with lightning further illustrate his method. Thunderstorms were common and dangerous, yet poorly understood. Franklin wondered whether lightning was a form of electricity similar to that produced in smaller experiments. Rather than proclaiming an answer, he devised ways to test the idea. These experiments were simple in concept, but required careful execution. The most famous of these involved drawing electrical charge from storm clouds. The experiment has often been dramatized in retellings, but Franklin's own descriptions emphasize caution and intent rather than drama. He was interested in confirmation, not risk. His observations suggested a connection between lightning and electricity, reinforcing the practical implication that lightning could be managed rather than feared blindly. From these insights emerged practical applications. Franklin designed lightning rods to protect buildings by directing electrical charge safely into the ground. This was not merely a scientific achievement, it was a civic one. Fires caused by lightning were a serious threat in colonial cities. By reducing this risk, Franklin's work directly improved public safety. Franklin did not patent the lightning rod or seek exclusive credit. He shared the design freely, encouraging adoption. This decision reflected his belief that useful knowledge belonged to the public. Recognition, when it came, was secondary. What mattered was function. As Franklin's scientific reputation spread, he received recognition from learned societies abroad. His work was discussed in Europe, and he was elected to prominent institutions. These honors acknowledged the quality of his contributions, but they did not alter his working habits. He continued experimenting, writing, and revising with the same restraint. Franklin remained skeptical of scientific pretension. He avoided elaborate terminology when simpler language sufficed. He valued explanations that could be understood by non-specialists. This approach reflected his background and reinforced his commitment to accessibility. Knowledge, he believed, should circulate widely to be useful. Despite growing fame, Franklin did not abandon other interests. Science did not replace civic engagement or writing, it complemented them. His experiments informed his understanding of infrastructure, safety, and comfort. His civic projects, in turn, raised practical questions that science could address. Franklin's scientific work also shaped his view of authority. He observed that evidence could challenge accepted beliefs without confrontation. Facts, presented clearly, often spoke for themselves. This insight influenced his later political approach. He learned that persuasion was most effective when grounded in shared observation rather than assertion. Time management remained essential. Franklin balanced experiments with correspondence, administration, and reading. He did not isolate himself from daily life to pursue inquiry. Instead, he integrated investigation into routine. This integration kept science connected to lived experience. Not all experiments succeeded. Some produced ambiguous results. Franklin documented these outcomes without embarrassment. Failure, in his view, was informative. It clarified limits and suggested new approaches. This attitude prevented discouragement and maintained momentum. Franklin's correspondence reveals his attentiveness to context. He adapted explanations to his audience, emphasizing different aspects depending on their background. With fellow investigators, he discussed theory and method. With civic leaders, he highlighted applications and safety. This flexibility reflected his broader communication skill. Scientific inquiry also deepened Franklin's humility. Each discovery revealed further complexity. He resisted claims of finality. The natural world, he understood, was not fully knowable through any single framework. This recognition tempered confidence without undermining curiosity. As Franklin's reputation grew internationally, visitors sought him out. They expected demonstrations and bold pronouncements. Franklin met these expectations selectively. He preferred conversation to performance. He explained processes patiently, answered questions thoughtfully, and avoided exaggeration. This demeanor reinforced his credibility. Franklin's scientific pursuits also influenced his writing style. He favored clarity, brevity, and structure. He distinguished observation from interpretation explicitly. This discipline improved his essays and correspondence, making them more precise and persuasive. Importantly, Franklin did not treat science as a pathway to social elevation. He accepted honors politely but did not seek to convert them into power. His identity remained rooted in usefulness. Science was another means of contributing, not a platform for authority. The broader cultural context supported Franklin's approach. Enlightenment ideals emphasized reason, observation, and improvement. Yet Franklin's contribution lay in grounding these ideals in practicality. He demonstrated that inquiry need not be abstract or exclusive. It could emerge from everyday questions and lead to tangible benefits. Franklin's scientific work also connected him more closely to international networks. Letters crossed oceans. Ideas circulated beyond colonial boundaries. This exchange broadened his perspective and prepared him for later diplomatic roles. He learned how ideas traveled, how misunderstandings arose, and how clarity could bridge distance. Throughout this period, Franklin remained attentive to balance. He did not allow science to eclipse other responsibilities. He recognized the danger of narrow focus. Improvement, in his view, required attention to multiple domains simultaneously. By the end of this phase, Franklin had achieved a rare synthesis. He was respected as a practical thinker, a careful investigator, and a reliable communicator. His scientific reputation rested not on spectacle, but on consistency and openness. He had shown that inquiry could be both rigorous and accessible, ambitious and restrained. These qualities would soon prove valuable beyond the realm of science. As political tensions intensified within the British Empire, Franklin's habits of observation, patience, and clear communication would be tested in new ways. The transition from scientific inquiry to political navigation would not be abrupt. It would follow the same pattern that had shaped his life so far: gradual, deliberate, and grounded in fame without vanity. By the time Benjamin Franklin reached his early 50s, a curious shift had taken place. Without seeking it, and without changing his manner, he had become known well beyond the boundaries of Pennsylvania. His name circulated in correspondence across the Atlantic. His experiments were discussed in learned societies. His essays were quoted and reprinted. Yet, within his daily life, little appeared different. Franklin continued to walk Philadelphia's streets without ceremony, attend meetings without announcement, and write letters with the same careful restraint that had defined his work for decades. This contrast between reputation and behavior was not accidental. Franklin had learned early that attention, once gained, demanded management. Fame could amplify usefulness, but it could also distort judgment. He observed how others responded to recognition, how confidence hardened into certainty, how public praise invited private resentment. Franklin resolved, quietly and deliberately, to treat reputation as a tool rather than a reward. Scientific recognition arrived first. Franklin's work on electricity had reached audiences in Britain and Europe, where experimental philosophy carried increasing prestige. His letters were circulated, translated, and discussed. Learned institutions elected him as a member, acknowledging his contributions formally. These honours carried weight, particularly for someone without university training or aristocratic background. Franklin accepted these distinctions politely, but without ceremony. He did not emphasize them in his own correspondence. He did not adopt titles or alter his manner of speech. When addressed with deference, he responded with ease rather than insistence. This behavior was not false modesty. It reflected his understanding that credibility rested on continued usefulness, not past achievement. At home, Franklin's daily routines remained consistent. He rose early, planned his work, and balanced correspondence with civic responsibilities. Letters occupied increasing portions of his time. He answered inquiries patiently, often repeating explanations in slightly different forms depending on the reader. This repetition did not irritate him. He understood that clarity often required restatement. Franklin's correspondence reveals a careful calibration of tone. He neither downplayed his findings excessively nor overstated them. He acknowledged uncertainty openly. When challenged, he responded with evidence rather than defense. This approach maintained trust and encouraged further dialogue. As his scientific reputation grew, Franklin received visitors from abroad. Travelers sought conversation, demonstrations, and guidance. Franklin welcomed these interactions selectively. He did not turn his home into a public stage. He preferred focused discussions over spectacle. Those who expected theatrical displays often left with something quieter but more lasting, a clearer understanding of method and mindset. This period also brought increased demand for Franklin's opinion on matters beyond science. Civic leaders, printers, and intellectuals sought his views on education, infrastructure, and organization. Franklin responded cautiously. He offered suggestions grounded in experience, not prescriptions. He avoided endorsing positions without sufficient context. Franklin's restraint was rooted in self-knowledge. He understood the limits of his expertise. While curious about many subjects, he did not assume mastery outside areas he had studied directly. This humility protected him from overreach and preserved his credibility. Financial independence supported this stance. Franklin had arranged his affairs so that his livelihood did not depend on public favor. He had gradually withdrawn from daily business operations, relying on partnerships structured carefully to ensure continuity. This independence freed him from pressures that might have compromised judgment. During this time, Franklin's role in Philadelphia's civic life remained active but understated. He continued supporting improvements in infrastructure, education, and safety. These efforts were practical and incremental. He did not frame them as visionary projects. He treated them as ongoing maintenance of a shared environment. One area where Franklin's influence expanded quietly was communication. His experience as a printer and correspondent made him acutely aware of how information moved and how misunderstandings arose. He advocated for clarity in public notices, consistency in procedures, and accessibility in language. These principles improved cooperation and reduced friction. Franklin's attitude toward authority remained pragmatic. He respected institutions when they functioned effectively and questioned them when they did not. His questioning was measured. He preferred adjustment over confrontation. This approach allowed him to navigate complex relationships without alienation. The colonies during this period were changing. Population growth, economic expansion, and increased literacy altered social dynamics. Ideas circulated more rapidly. Discontent surfaced alongside opportunity. Franklin observed these shifts attentively. He did not rush to interpret them through ideology. He collected impressions, listened to multiple perspectives, and noted patterns. His writing reflected this attentiveness. He continued publishing practical essays and advice, but he also began addressing broader themes cautiously. He wrote about cooperation, mutual dependence, and the importance of institutions that balanced individual initiative with collective responsibility. These writings did not advocate political change explicitly. They laid conceptual groundwork. Franklin's fame also carried risks. Some viewed his ideas with suspicion, interpreting influence as ambition. Franklin responded by maintaining transparency. He explained his reasoning openly and avoided exclusive alliances. This openness diffused tension and reinforced trust. Within his personal life, Franklin remained consistent. He valued privacy and routine. Social gatherings were chosen carefully. He enjoyed conversation, but avoided excess. Leisure activities were balanced with purpose. These habits preserved energy and focus. Franklin's correspondence from this period shows increasing awareness of international context. European thinkers debated science, governance, and society. Franklin followed these discussions with interest, comparing them to colonial experience. He did not idealize Europe. He recognized its intellectual richness alongside its rigid hierarchies. This comparative perspective sharpened Franklin's understanding of colonial conditions. He saw opportunities for improvement alongside vulnerabilities. He noted how distance from centralized authority allowed flexibility, but also how lack of coordination created inefficiency. These observations would later inform his political thinking. Despite growing prominence, Franklin remained cautious about public identity. He avoided becoming a symbol. Symbols invited simplification. Franklin preferred complexity. He allowed different audiences to see different aspects of his work without forcing a unified image. This adaptability was not deception. It reflected genuine multiplicity. Franklin was simultaneously a printer, scientist, civic organizer, and correspondent. He did not attempt to reconcile these roles into a single narrative. He allowed them to coexist. Franklin's restraint also extended to conflict. When disagreements arose, he sought resolution through explanation rather than assertion. He listened carefully, identified points of overlap, and emphasized shared goals. This method reduced polarization and preserved relationships. The accumulation of recognition did not alter Franklin's long-term goals. He did not seek office for its own sake. He did not attempt to leverage fame into control. His ambition remained focused on usefulness. Recognition mattered only insofar as it expanded capacity to contribute. As the decade progressed, Franklin's network expanded further. He corresponded with individuals across the colonies and abroad. These exchanges enriched his understanding and created informal channels of influence. Information flowed both ways. Franklin shared insights and absorbed concerns. This network would soon become politically significant, though at this stage it remained primarily intellectual and civic. Franklin did not yet position himself as a political actor on a larger stage. He observed conditions carefully, preparing quietly. Franklin's ability to hold recognition without being shaped by it was perhaps one of his most distinctive qualities. He did not reject honor, nor did he chase it. He accepted it as acknowledgement of work done, then returned to work still to be done. By the end of this period, Franklin stood at a threshold. He was widely respected, financially independent, and deeply connected through correspondence and experience. His habits of restraint, clarity, and adaptability had been tested and reinforced. He had learned how to move within systems without being absorbed by them. These qualities would soon be required in a new context. Political tensions within the British Empire were intensifying. Issues that had once seemed distant were becoming unavoidable. Franklin's transition from observer and facilitator to active participant would not involve a sudden change of character. It would follow the same pattern that had defined his life: careful attention, gradual adjustment, and a steady commitment to usefulness. Civic duty in practice. As Benjamin Franklin moved further into the middle years of his life, the boundary between private initiative and public responsibility became increasingly porous. He had never drawn a sharp line between the two. From the beginning, his understanding of improvement assumed that personal habits, professional competence, and civic order were interconnected. By his mid-50s, this assumption had hardened into practice. Franklin did not enter public life with fanfare or ideology. He drifted into it gradually, responding to needs as they became clear and accepting roles that matched his skills rather than his status. Public service in colonial America rarely resembled later forms of political office. It was often unpaid, time-consuming, and entangled with practical problems that resisted neat solutions. Franklin did not seek titles or authority. He accepted responsibilities because they required doing, and because few others were willing or able to do them effectively. This attitude shaped both the scope and tone of his civic engagement. One of Franklin's most consequential roles involved communication. Long before formal political authority expanded, the functioning of communities depended on reliable exchange of information. Notices had to circulate. Instructions had to be understood. Coordination required consistency. Franklin's experience as a printer made him acutely aware of how small failures in communication could produce large disruptions. Misread announcements, delayed messages, and ambiguous wording often caused conflict where none was intended. Franklin brought this sensitivity into public work. He advocated for clearer procedures, standardized formats, and accessible language. He did not frame these efforts as reforms. He treated them as maintenance. Systems, he believed, degraded without attention. Clear communication was not an innovation, it was a necessity. His appointment to oversee aspects of postal service reflected this understanding. Mail in the colonies was irregular and unreliable. Routes were inconsistent. Delivery times varied widely. Franklin approached the problem methodically. He assessed routes, schedules, and bottlenecks. He identified inefficiencies not by assigning blame, but by observing patterns. Where delays occurred, he asked why. Where routes failed, he examined conditions. Improvement came through incremental adjustments. Routes were reorganized. Schedules were tightened. Accountability increased. Franklin emphasized predictability. Even if mail could not move quickly, it could move consistently. This consistency, he understood, allowed individuals and institutions to plan. Over time, reliability built trust in the system. Franklin's work with the Postal Service also expanded his understanding of the colonies as an interconnected whole. Letters revealed concerns from distant towns. Patterns emerged across regions. Economic pressures, local disputes, and shared frustrations surfaced repeatedly. Franklin absorbed these signals quietly. They informed his sense of colonial life beyond Philadelphia without demanding immediate conclusions. Civic duty also extended to public safety. Franklin continued supporting fire prevention and response, refining earlier efforts as the city grew. Volunteer companies required coordination, training, and resources. Franklin contributed to organization and planning, ensuring that enthusiasm translated into effectiveness. He did not attempt to control these groups. He encouraged autonomy within shared standards. Street maintenance, sanitation, and lighting also occupied Franklin's attention. These matters lacked glamour, but affected daily life directly. Poorly maintained streets hindered trade and increased accidents. Inadequate sanitation contributed to illness. Darkness invited disorder. Franklin framed solutions in practical terms, emphasizing shared benefit rather than obligation. Improvements were presented as investments in collective comfort and security. Franklin's ability to move between roles, organizer, advisor, and participant made him effective. He did not insist on recognition. When projects succeeded, he allowed credit to disperse. When problems arose, he addressed them without defensiveness. This approach reduced resistance and sustained momentum. Education remained a central concern. Franklin supported efforts to improve schooling, particularly in subjects that prepared individuals for practical engagement with the world. He encouraged instruction in writing, arithmetic, geography, and modern languages. These subjects, he believed, equipped people to navigate commerce, correspondence, and civic participation more effectively than exclusive focus on classical texts. Franklin did not oppose traditional education. He questioned its sufficiency. The colonies faced challenges that demanded adaptability. Education, in his view, should respond to context. This position reflected his broader philosophy. Institutions existed to serve living communities, not to preserve forms detached from use. As Franklin's civic involvement deepened, his understanding of authority evolved. He did not view authority as inherently problematic, nor did he accept it uncritically. Authority, he believed, was justified by function. When it facilitated cooperation and reduced harm, it deserved respect. When it obstructed improvement, it warranted revision. This functional view informed Franklin's interactions with colonial administration. He cooperated with officials where possible and challenged procedures when necessary. His challenges were framed in terms of efficiency and fairness rather than principle alone. This approach made them harder to dismiss and easier to adopt. Franklin's manner in meetings was consistent. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he focused on specific issues rather than general positions. He avoided absolutes. He proposed experiments rather than solutions, inviting trial and adjustment. This style reflected his scientific habits and reinforced his credibility. Public trust in Franklin grew steadily. People knew he did not pursue office for personal gain. They recognized his willingness to handle unappealing tasks. This trust translated into influence, though Franklin remained careful not to confuse the two. Influence, he understood, was fragile. It required maintenance through continued reliability. Civic duty also imposed strain. Meetings consumed time, correspondence increased, travel became necessary. Franklin managed these demands through careful scheduling and delegation. He remained attentive to balance, recognizing that exhaustion undermined judgment. Rest and reflection were treated as components of effectiveness, not indulgences. Franklin's personal writing during this period reflects increasing concern with institutional resilience. He observed that systems built around individuals often failed when those individuals withdrew. Sustainable institutions required shared norms, clear procedures, and distributed responsibility. This insight guided his approach to reform. He focused on structures rather than personalities. The colonies themselves were becoming more complex. Economic growth introduced new tensions. Urban centers expanded. Rural and urban interests diverged. Franklin observed these dynamics without alarm. He believed that complexity was manageable through cooperation and adaptability. Conflict arose not from difference alone, but from misaligned expectations and poor communication. Franklin's civic work also sharpened his awareness of limits. Some problems resisted solution despite effort. Resources were finite. Consensus was elusive. Franklin accepted these constraints without resignation. He adjusted expectations and sought partial improvements rather than complete resolution. Progress, he believed, was cumulative. Throughout this period, Franklin maintained a deliberate distance from ideological extremes. He avoided aligning himself fully with any faction. This neutrality allowed him to act as an intermediary when disputes arose. He could translate concerns across groups without appearing to favor one side unduly. Franklin's moderation was sometimes misunderstood as indecision. He accepted this risk. He preferred delayed judgment to premature certainty. Decisions made too quickly, he believed, often required correction later at greater cost. Patience, though less visible, often proved more effective. As his civic responsibilities expanded, Franklin's correspondence broadened further. letters arrived from other colonies describing local challenges. Franklin responded with questions and suggestions rather than directives. He encouraged experimentation and adaptation. His advice was framed as experience shared, not authority imposed. This approach fostered a sense of shared problem-solving. Franklin did not present himself as a central planner. He functioned as a connector, linking ideas and experiences across distance. This role would later become politically significant, though at this stage it remained informal. Franklin's increasing exposure to colonial administration also revealed tensions between local needs and imperial policies. Regulations imposed from afar often failed to account for local conditions. Franklin noted these mismatches carefully. He did not yet interpret them as systemic failures. He viewed them as coordination problems, potentially solvable through dialogue. His belief in dialogue was genuine. He assumed that misunderstandings could be clarified through explanation and evidence. This assumption shaped his early responses to imperial tensions. He did not anticipate rupture, he anticipated adjustment. Franklin's civic philosophy during this period rested on several core assumptions: that people generally preferred order to chaos, that institutions could be improved through practical reform, and that cooperation was more sustainable than coercion. These assumptions had served him well locally. Whether they would hold at a larger scale remained uncertain. By the end of this phase, Franklin had become an essential figure in Philadelphia's civic life, not because he commanded authority, but because he facilitated function. His presence reduced friction. His absence would have been noticed not through absence of direction, but through accumulation of small failures. This form of influence rarely attracts attention. It leaves few monuments, yet it shapes daily experience profoundly. Franklin understood this and accepted it. He did not seek legacy through grand acts. He built it through maintenance and adjustment. As pressures within the British Empire continued to mount, the skills Franklin had honed in civic duty, listening, translating, coordinating, would soon be tested beyond local boundaries. The shift from municipal concerns to imperial politics would challenge his assumptions and require recalibration. The habits he had cultivated would remain the same. The scale of their application would change between empire and colonies. By the late 1752s, the world Benjamin Franklin had known for most of his life was beginning to change in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The colonies were no longer small, loosely connected settlements concerned mainly with local survival. They were growing societies with expanding trade networks, rising populations, and increasing confidence. At the same time, the British Empire, stretched across continents, was reassessing how it governed and financed its far-flung territories. Franklin found himself positioned quietly, but unmistakably, between these two evolving realities. For much of his earlier life, Franklin had regarded the relationship between Britain and the colonies as fundamentally cooperative. The empire provided protection, access to markets, and a shared legal and cultural framework. In return, the colonies offered loyalty, trade, and strategic value. Imperfections existed, but Franklin believed they could be addressed through communication and reform. His instincts, shaped by decades of civic problem-solving, leaned toward adjustment rather than rupture. Franklin's growing involvement in imperial matters did not begin with ideology. It began with administration. As his responsibilities within the postal system expanded, he became increasingly aware of how information moved, or failed to move, across colonial boundaries. Delays, inconsistencies, and misunderstandings were common. These were not merely technical problems, they influenced trust, coordination, and perception. Franklin saw clearly that distance complicated governance, and that policies formed in London often arrived stripped of local context. Travel between colonies exposed Franklin to regional differences that challenged simplistic assumptions. Economic priorities varied. Coastal merchants, inland farmers, frontier settlers, and urban craftsmen experienced imperial regulation differently. Franklin listened carefully to these perspectives, resisting the urge to generalize prematurely. He noticed that grievances were often practical rather than ideological. People objected less to authority itself than to inefficiency, inconsistency, and perceived unfairness. At the same time, Franklin maintained strong ties with Britain. He corresponded with officials, scientists, and administrators. His scientific reputation had opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. He was received not as a colonial agitator, but as a respected contributor to shared intellectual life. This access reinforced his belief that reasoned dialogue remained possible. The outbreak and conduct of imperial conflicts further complicated the picture. Wars required coordination, funding, and sacrifice. Colonial participation was substantial, yet recognition and decision-making remained concentrated in Britain. Franklin observed how this imbalance generated resentment quietly. Colonists bore costs without corresponding influence. Franklin did not interpret this immediately as injustice. He saw it as a misalignment of responsibility and authority, an administrative problem that demanded attention. Franklin's efforts during this period focused on mediation. He explained colonial concerns to British officials, framing them in terms of efficiency and sustainability rather than defiance. He urged recognition of local knowledge and flexibility in implementation. Conversely, he encouraged colonial leaders to appreciate imperial constraints and broader strategic considerations. His role was that of translator rather than advocate. This position required restraint. Franklin avoided inflammatory language. He chose words carefully, emphasizing shared interests. He believed that escalation often resulted from misunderstanding compounded by pride. By lowering emotional temperature, he hoped to preserve space for compromise. Yet signs of strain accumulated. Policies designed to standardize administration often ignored local realities. Enforcement mechanisms became more rigid. Financial pressures led to revenue measures that colonists perceived as imposed rather than negotiated. Franklin watched these developments with growing concern. His confidence in adjustment remained, but it was no longer unqualified. Franklin's own experiences began to reflect this shift. As he interacted more frequently with imperial authorities, he encountered attitudes that surprised him. Some officials viewed the colonies less as partners and more as dependents. Assumptions about colonial inferiority surfaced subtly in conversation and correspondence. Franklin noted these moments without immediate reaction, storing them alongside earlier observations. Despite these tensions, Franklin resisted adopting a confrontational stance. He continued to believe that long-term stability required cooperation. He reminded colonial leaders that Britain's institutions had evolved gradually through negotiation and precedent. He urged patience, arguing that abrupt challenges risked hardening positions on both sides. This stance was not universally popular. Some colonists viewed Franklin's moderation as complacency. Others accused him of excessive deference. Franklin accepted these criticisms without defensiveness. He understood that his position exposed him to mistrust from multiple directions. He believed, however, that credibility depended on consistency rather than popularity. Franklin's letters from this period reveal careful reasoning. He distinguished between policies that were flawed and intentions that were malicious. He argued that many problems stemmed from distance, outdated assumptions, and administrative inertia, rather than deliberate exploitation. This distinction mattered to him. It preserved the possibility of reform without conflict. At the same time, Franklin's understanding of power was deepening. He recognized that systems did not change simply because problems were identified. Incentives, interests, and perceptions shaped outcomes. Reasoned argument, while necessary, was not always sufficient. This realization unsettled him, though he did not abandon dialogue. Colonial society itself was changing. Literacy rates increased, newspapers circulated widely, public discussion became more frequent and more pointed. Franklin observed this shift with mixed feelings. On one hand, informed debate supported accountability. On the other, simplified narratives risked inflaming sentiment. Franklin worried that nuance would be lost as positions hardened. His own role in shaping public opinion remained cautious. He avoided publishing overt political arguments. He believed that premature polarization would undermine constructive reform. Instead, he continued emphasizing shared values: fairness, practicality, mutual benefit. Whether these appeals could withstand mounting pressure remained uncertain. Franklin's scientific and intellectual standing continued to provide a measure of insulation. He could speak across divides that were closing to others, yet even this standing had limits. As political stakes rose, identity began to overshadow argument. Franklin sensed this shift, but did not fully grasp its implications at first. Personal relationships also reflected growing strain. Friends in Britain expressed frustration with colonial resistance. Friends in the colonies expressed impatience with imperial control. Franklin navigated these conversations carefully, often emphasizing understanding over agreement. He believed that maintaining relationships preserved channels for future resolution. Throughout this period, Franklin remained committed to incremental improvement. He continued working on administrative reforms, communication systems, and civic projects. These efforts were not separate from political concerns. They represented his belief that effective institutions could reduce conflict by addressing practical grievances. Yet events increasingly moved faster than reform. Economic pressures mounted, enforcement tightened, symbolic issues took on outsized importance. Franklin watched as disputes that might once have been resolved through adjustment became tests of authority. Franklin's internal posture began to shift subtly. He did not abandon loyalty to Britain, but he became more aware of its fragility. He questioned whether imperial structures could adapt quickly enough to colonial realities. This questioning was cautious and private, but it marked a turning point. Importantly, Franklin did not interpret conflict as inevitable. He still believed that human institutions could learn. His life had taught him that habits could change, systems could be improved, and misunderstandings could be corrected. Yet he also recognized that scale complicated these processes. What worked in a city might not work across an empire. As Franklin moved deeper into imperial affairs, his role grew more demanding. Travel increased, correspondence intensified, decisions carried greater consequence. He managed these pressures with the same discipline he had applied throughout his life. Careful scheduling, measured response, and attention to detail. This period between empire and colonies tested Franklin's core assumptions. He confronted limits to persuasion and patience that he had not previously encountered. The habits that had served him so well locally were now challenged by larger forces beyond individual control. By the end of this phase, Franklin stood at a crossroads. He remained committed to cooperation, yet increasingly aware of systemic tension. He continued to act as mediator, but he sensed that the ground beneath that role was shifting. The balance he had worked to maintain was becoming harder to sustain. What Franklin did not yet know was how profoundly these pressures would reshape his path. The transition from mediator to advocate would not come through a single decision or dramatic event. It would emerge gradually, as accumulated experience forced re-evaluation. The patience that had once preserved harmony would soon confront limits imposed by power, pride, and distance. London years and disillusion. Benjamin Franklin's extended stay in London marked one of the most demanding and formative periods of his life. Not because it transformed his character, but because it tested it under sustained pressure. He arrived in Britain not as a radical or opponent of imperial authority, but as a representative seeking resolution. His purpose was clear in his own mind: to explain colonial conditions accurately, to correct misunderstandings, and to advocate for arrangements that preserved cooperation within the empire. What he encountered over the following years gradually altered his understanding of how power listened and how it refused to listen. Franklin's position in London was unusual. He was neither an official diplomat nor a private citizen without influence. He served as an agent for several colonies, charged with presenting grievances and negotiating adjustments. His scientific reputation granted him access to intellectual and social circles otherwise closed to colonial representatives. He was invited to salons, conversed with philosophers, and moved comfortably among educated elites. This access reinforced his belief that dialogue remained possible. At first, Franklin approached his role with familiar confidence. He prepared carefully, gathered evidence, and framed arguments in terms of mutual benefit. He emphasized that colonial prosperity strengthened the empire and that local autonomy, exercised responsibly, reduced administrative burden. His reasoning was practical, consistent with his lifelong approach to problem solving. Yet as discussions continued, Franklin noticed a persistent pattern. Colonial arguments were often acknowledged politely, then set aside. Decisions had already been made elsewhere. Consultation did not necessarily imply influence. Franklin began to recognize that the mechanisms of imperial governance were less flexible than he had assumed. Social encounters revealed deeper assumptions. While many individuals treated Franklin with respect, institutional attitudes were slower to shift. Colonies were increasingly viewed through a lens of control rather than partnership. Franklin observed how discussions framed colonial concerns as inconveniences rather than legitimate issues. This framing troubled him more than open hostility would have. It suggested a structural dismissal rather than a misunderstanding. Franklin's patience was tested repeatedly. He attended hearings, submitted petitions, and engaged in correspondence that stretched over months and years. Responses were delayed, equivocal, or contradictory. Promises were made, then quietly withdrawn. Franklin documented these developments carefully, noting patterns rather than isolated incidents. Despite frustration, Franklin maintained composure. He avoided inflammatory language and resisted personalizing disagreements. He continued to believe that reasoned persistence might yet produce results. His discipline in this regard was remarkable. Many others in his position would have reacted more sharply. Franklin's restraint, however, also had limits. One particularly difficult episode involved public questioning that challenged Franklin's credibility and integrity. He was subjected to scrutiny that went beyond policy disagreement, implying disloyalty and incompetence. The experience was deeply unsettling, not because of personal insult, but because it revealed the fragility of trust he had worked to build. Franklin did not respond with anger. He answered questions calmly, relying on evidence and consistency. Yet the encounter left a lasting impression. It demonstrated that colonial representatives could be humiliated without consequence, regardless of reason or service. The episode crystallized doubts Franklin had been accumulating quietly. Living in London also sharpened Franklin's awareness of class and distance. He moved within intellectual circles that valued inquiry and debate, yet political decisions remained insulated from those norms. Authority operated through hierarchy rather than persuasion. Franklin saw clearly now that access did not equal agency. Meanwhile, conditions in the colonies continued to evolve. Correspondence from America described rising discontent and hardening attitudes. Franklin read these letters carefully, comparing colonial perceptions with imperial assumptions. The gap between the two widened steadily. Franklin's personal life during this period was marked by restraint and routine. He maintained his habits of reading, correspondence, and reflection. These routines provided stability amid uncertainty. He continued scientific engagement, though it receded behind political demands. Science remained a refuge of clarity, in contrast to the ambiguity of governance. Gradually, Franklin's outlook shifted. He did not abandon belief in cooperation, but he recognized that structural barriers limited its reach. Reform, he concluded, required willingness from those in power. Without that willingness, persuasion alone could not succeed. This realization did not produce immediate advocacy for separation. Franklin was too experienced, too cautious for sudden conclusions. Instead, he recalibrated expectations. He began preparing for the possibility that accommodation might fail. This preparation was intellectual rather than emotional. He gathered information, assessed alternatives, and considered consequences. Franklin's time in London also altered how he understood loyalty. Loyalty, he concluded, was reciprocal. It depended on recognition and respect. When those were absent, obligation weakened. This insight emerged slowly, shaped by observation rather than ideology. By the time Franklin prepared to leave London, he was no longer the confident mediator who had arrived years earlier. He was still measured and composed, but his assumptions had changed. He understood now that imperial authority prioritized control over adaptation. The space for compromise had narrowed. Franklin returned to America, older, more cautious, and more realistic. He carried with him not bitterness, but clarity. His experience in London had stripped away illusions without eroding discipline. He was prepared to engage a new reality with the same tools he had always used: attention, restraint, and practical judgment. The disillusionment Franklin experienced was not dramatic. It unfolded through delays, dismissals, and quiet indignities. yet its impact was profound. It marked the end of one phase of his life and the beginning of another one, in which his commitment to usefulness would be tested on a far larger stage, the turn toward independence. When Benjamin Franklin returned to America after his long and trying years in London, he did not arrive as a revolutionary voice or a fiery advocate for separation. He arrived as a man who had exhausted the available paths of compromise and had learned, slowly and carefully, where those paths ended. The shift that followed was not abrupt. It did not arise from anger or wounded pride. It emerged from accumulated evidence, weighed over time, and accepted with reluctance. Franklin's first impressions upon returning were shaped by contrast. Colonial life felt more immediate, more responsive, and more grounded than the distant deliberations he had left behind. Conversations moved quickly from theory to consequence. Decisions were debated in taverns, assemblies, and meeting halls, not confined to closed chambers. Franklin listened closely, comparing these discussions to the procedural rigidity he had observed in Britain. The colonies he encountered were not unified in outlook. Differences of interest, region, and temperament remained pronounced. Some colonists still hoped for reconciliation, others spoke openly of resistance. Franklin did not align himself immediately with any camp. He preferred to observe, to assess whether the conditions he had witnessed in London were understood locally or still underestimated. What he found was a growing impatience, rooted in experience rather than ideology. Many colonists no longer objected merely to specific policies. They objected to a pattern of disregard. Laws were imposed without meaningful consultation. Enforcement tightened even as explanations remained vague. Franklin recognized these complaints. He had voiced similar concerns abroad and had watched them dismissed. Franklin began sharing his experiences in London privately, not as warnings, but as context. He described the limits of persuasion he had encountered, the assumptions held by imperial authorities, and the structural obstacles to reform. These accounts carried weight because they were measured and specific. Franklin did not exaggerate. He reported what he had seen and heard, allowing others to draw conclusions. This sharing marked an important transition. Franklin moved from mediator to witness. His role shifted from advocating accommodation to clarifying reality. He did not yet argue for independence. He focused instead on honesty. Colonial leaders, he believed, needed accurate information to make informed decisions. The response to Franklin's accounts was varied. Some were unsettled, others felt confirmed in suspicions long held. Franklin observed these reactions without judgment. He understood that acceptance of difficult conclusions required time. He had taken years to reach his own. Meanwhile, imperial measures continued to tighten. Policies aimed at asserting authority were implemented with increasing rigidity. Franklin noted that these measures often treated symptoms rather than causes. Resistance was met with enforcement rather than inquiry. This pattern reinforced his growing belief that reform within existing structures was unlikely. Franklin's correspondence during this period reflects careful reasoning. He distinguished between emotional reaction and strategic assessment. Independence, he argued privately, was not an abstract ideal. It was a practical question. Could the colonies govern themselves more effectively than they were being governed from afar? Were they capable of maintaining order, defense, and cooperation without imperial oversight? These questions mattered more to Franklin than appeals to principle alone. His entire life had been shaped by practical considerations. He believed that political arrangements should be judged by outcomes rather than intentions. Independence, if pursued, needed to be justified not by rhetoric but by capacity. Franklin also considered the risks. Separation carried uncertainties. Economic disruption was likely. Military conflict was possible. Internal divisions could surface. Franklin did not minimize these dangers. He believed that honest appraisal was essential. Overconfidence, he had seen, often led to failure. At the same time, Franklin recognized that continued subordination carried its own risks. Policies imposed without representation eroded trust. Enforcement without consent invited resistance. Over time, these dynamics threatened stability more than change might. Franklin's thinking increasingly framed independence as a choice between manageable uncertainty and ongoing erosion. Franklin's influence during this period lay less in public speeches than in private counsel. He advised leaders to prepare carefully, to strengthen institutions, and to avoid premature confrontation. Preparation, in his view, was not a sign of aggression, it was a safeguard against chaos. He emphasized the importance of unity. Fragmentation, he warned, would undermine any attempt at self-governance. Differences of interest needed to be managed through compromise rather than suppressed. Franklin's own life had taught him that cooperation required patience and restraint. Franklin also urged attention to legitimacy. Any move toward independence needed broad support to succeed. Decisions imposed by narrow groups would lack durability. This emphasis on legitimacy reflected his deep respect for process. Authority, he believed, derived from participation. As debates intensified, Franklin's position became clearer. He no longer believed that the imperial system could be reformed sufficiently to accommodate colonial realities. This conclusion was not announced publicly as doctrine. It emerged through consistent reasoning shared with trusted colleagues. Franklin's reputation lent weight to his views. He was known for moderation, patience, and reason. When such a figure expressed doubt about reconciliation, others listened. His credibility rested not on dramatic rhetoric, but on a record of restraint. At the same time, Franklin avoided inflaming sentiment. He did not portray Britain as inherently tyrannical. He framed the conflict as structural rather than moral. This framing reduced the risk of irreversible hostility. Franklin hoped that even if separation occurred, future relations might be cooperative rather than embittered. This measured approach also reflected Franklin's awareness of history. He understood that revolutions often devoured their own aims when driven by excess. He sought to temper urgency with foresight. Independence, if pursued, needed to be orderly. Franklin's own emotions during this transition were subdued. He did not express triumph or indignation. Instead, he conveyed a sense of inevitability grounded in experience. The tone was sober rather than celebratory. He understood that the consequences of independence would extend far beyond his lifetime. Franklin's scientific habits influenced his political reasoning. He treated events as data points, patterns to be interpreted, rather than provocations to be answered reflexively. This discipline helped him maintain clarity amid escalating tension. The turn toward independence was therefore not a single moment, but a gradual alignment of conclusions. Franklin's belief in accommodation eroded not because he abandoned it, but because it proved unsupported by evidence. His acceptance of independence was reluctant, careful, and grounded in assessment. As colonial leaders moved closer to decisive action, Franklin's role became increasingly important. His experience, credibility, and restraint made him a stabilizing presence. He could articulate the case for independence without exaggeration and acknowledge its risks without discouragement. By the end of this period, Franklin had crossed an internal threshold. He no longer saw independence as a remote possibility. He saw it as the most viable path remaining. This conclusion did not bring excitement, it brought responsibility. Franklin understood that the work ahead would be demanding. Building new institutions required discipline, cooperation, and patience. The habits he had cultivated over decades, clarity, moderation, persistence, would be essential. This turn toward independence marked one of the most consequential shifts in Franklin's life. Yet it occurred without spectacle. It unfolded through letters, conversations, and careful thought. The absence of drama was itself revealing. Franklin did not need to reinvent himself. He applied the same principles he had always used to a new and larger problem. As events accelerated and declarations loomed, Franklin stood prepared not as a firebrand, but as a builder. The work of separation would require calm minds as much as bold decisions. Franklin was ready to contribute in the way he always had, steadily, practically, and with an eye toward lasting function rather than momentary triumph. Diplomat of calm persistence. When Benjamin Franklin departed for France during the American War for Independence, he did so not as a triumphant symbol of a new nation, but as a practical emissary charged with an exacting task. The success of the American cause depended heavily on foreign support, and France, with its resources, navy, and rivalry with Britain, was the most important potential ally. Franklin understood this clearly. He also understood that success would depend less on dramatic appeals than on sustained credibility, patience, and careful judgment. Franklin arrived in France at an age when many men withdrew from demanding public roles. He was in his early 70s, physically tired at times, and keenly aware of the cost of travel and negotiation. Yet his habits of discipline and moderation remained intact. He approached the mission not as a short campaign, but as a prolonged effort requiring endurance and restraint. France presented a complex environment. Its court culture was formal, hierarchical, and shaped by long-established rituals. Influence operated through relationships, reputation, and timing, rather than direct argument alone. Franklin observed these dynamics carefully, just as he had once studied print shops and civic meetings. He did not attempt to impose his own style abruptly. He adapted without surrendering his principles. Franklin's public image in France was shaped partly by his scientific reputation and partly by deliberate simplicity. He dressed plainly, spoke calmly, and avoided ostentation. This manner distinguished him from other diplomats and appealed to French intellectual circles fascinated by ideas of natural virtue and reason. Franklin did not cultivate this image aggressively. He allowed it to develop organically, supported by consistency. At the same time, Franklin remained cautious about becoming a symbol. He understood that admiration could fade quickly if expectations were disappointed. He focused instead on building trust within decision-making circles. Conversations were measured. Requests were framed in terms of shared interest rather than desperation. Franklin's diplomatic strategy emphasized persistence over pressure. He knew that French leaders weighed risks carefully. Supporting the American cause meant confronting Britain openly, with potential military and economic consequences. Franklin did not minimize these risks. He acknowledged them and worked to demonstrate that American resistance was durable and organized enough to justify investment. Information was central to this effort. Franklin provided updates on military developments, political unity, and economic capacity. He was careful to distinguish between confirmed facts and hopeful projections. This honesty enhanced credibility. French officials learned that Franklin's reports could be trusted even when they were cautious. Franklin also understood the importance of tone. He avoided language that framed France as a savior or America as a supplicant. He emphasized partnership. The struggle, he suggested, aligned with French strategic interests as well as broader principles of balance and autonomy. This framing respected French agency and reduced the appearance of manipulation. Behind the scenes, Franklin's days were filled with correspondence. Letters traveled slowly, and decisions often lagged behind events. Franklin managed these delays with patience. He did not flood officials with demands. He allowed time for consideration, recognizing that pressure often hardened resistance. Franklin's personal habits during this period reflected his long-established discipline. He maintained regular routines, balanced work with rest, and guarded his health carefully. He knew that effectiveness depended on endurance. Moments of fatigue were acknowledged but not indulged. French society also offered intellectual stimulation. Franklin engaged with philosophers, scientists, and writers who were curious about the American experiment. These conversations were not directly political, but they shaped public perception. Franklin explained American conditions calmly, emphasizing practical governance rather than abstract ideals. This approach resonated with audiences interested in reform, grounded in experience. Franklin's ability to move between formal diplomacy and informal conversation proved invaluable. In salons and private gatherings, he listened as much as he spoke. He learned how French thinkers interpreted events and adjusted explanations accordingly. Misunderstandings were clarified gently. Differences were acknowledged without defensiveness. As months passed, French support increased gradually. Initial assistance came in the form of supplies and financial aid, often discreetly. Franklin accepted these steps without pressing for immediate escalation. He understood that gradual commitment allowed France to manage risk internally. Setbacks occurred. Military news from America was uneven. Some defeats undermined confidence. Franklin responded by contextualizing events rather than denying them. Wars, he reminded his interlocutors, rarely progressed in straight lines. What mattered was resilience and capacity to recover. Franklin's calm in the face of uncertainty distinguished him from others who reacted more sharply to setbacks. He did not overstate victories or conceal losses. This steadiness reassured French officials that the American cause was not built on illusion. Eventually, conditions aligned. France moved toward open alliance, committing military and financial resources. Franklin's role in this outcome was significant, though not singular. He did not claim credit. He recognized that diplomacy was collective and contingent. Timing, circumstance, and broader strategy all played roles. Throughout this period, Franklin maintained awareness of long-term implications. An alliance formed under pressure could strain relations later. He emphasized mutual respect and clear agreements. Terms were negotiated carefully, with attention to future independence rather than immediate advantage. Franklin's conduct in France reflected the principles that had guided his life. He relied on clarity rather than charisma, patience rather than urgency, and consistency rather than spectacle. These qualities were particularly effective in a diplomatic environment prone to ceremony and display. The personal cost of this work was real. Franklin lived far from home, separated from familiar routines and relationships. He accepted this distance as part of responsibility. Complaints were rare. When expressed privately, they were measured. Franklin's age also shaped his perspective. He viewed events with a long horizon. Temporary frustrations mattered less than durable outcomes. This perspective tempered reactions and encouraged compromise when appropriate. As the alliance solidified and the war progressed, Franklin's position became more secure. His reputation in France was strong, built on reliability rather than manipulation. He had become a trusted intermediary between governments with distinct interests. Franklin did not treat success as an endpoint. He continued to manage relationships carefully, aware that alliances required maintenance. Gratitude, transparency, and restraint remained essential. He avoided triumphalism. He understood that circumstances could change quickly. Franklin's diplomatic work demonstrated that influence could be exercised quietly and effectively. He did not dominate negotiations. He shaped them through presence, patience, and trust. This approach aligned with his lifelong preference for incremental progress over dramatic intervention. By the time Franklin prepared to return to America, the diplomatic landscape had shifted significantly. The American cause was no longer isolated. International recognition and support had altered the balance. Franklin's contribution lay in making this shift possible without provoking unnecessary hostility or unrealistic expectations. This phase of Franklin's life confirmed the value of habits cultivated over decades. The skills he had developed as a printer, civic organizer, and scientist translated naturally into diplomacy. Observation, clarity, moderation, and persistence proved effective across contexts. Franklin returned from France not as a conqueror or symbol, but as a seasoned negotiator who had helped secure conditions for independence to succeed. His work abroad had been demanding and often uncertain, but it reflected a consistent philosophy that durable outcomes were built through patience, trust, and attention to detail. As he turned toward the next stage of his life, Franklin carried with him the lessons of diplomacy. They would soon be applied again, this time to the challenge of shaping a nation's internal structure. The calm persistence that had served him in France would prove equally necessary at home. War seen from abroad. For Benjamin Franklin, the years of war unfolded largely at a distance from the battlefield. While armies marched and clashed across American soil, Franklin remained in Europe, receiving reports weeks or months after events occurred. This distance shaped his understanding of the conflict in a way that differed from those who experienced it directly. War, for Franklin, was not a sequence of dramatic moments. It was a prolonged condition marked by uncertainty, incomplete information, and the constant need to translate events for audiences far removed from their immediate consequences. Franklin's position abroad required him to interpret the war simultaneously for multiple listeners. French officials needed reassurance that their support was justified and effective. American leaders required confirmation that diplomatic efforts were succeeding. European observers, many of them neutral or cautious, watched closely to see whether the American experiment would endure or collapse under pressure. Franklin stood at the intersection of these perspectives, responsible for conveying events accurately without amplifying fear or fostering unrealistic optimism. The flow of information during this period was slow and uneven. Letters crossed the Atlantic at the mercy of weather, naval patrols, and chance. News often arrived fragmented, contradictory, or outdated by the time it was read. Franklin learned to work within these constraints. He compared sources, weighed credibility, and resisted reacting to single reports. This discipline was essential. Overreaction could undermine confidence. Silence could invite speculation. Franklin's correspondence reveals a careful approach to uncertainty. When reporting setbacks, he provided context rather than alarm. Losses were acknowledged, but framed as part of a broader struggle. When victories occurred, he resisted exaggeration. He emphasized preparation, coordination, and endurance, rather than decisive triumph. This balanced presentation reinforced his reputation for reliability. Living abroad also allowed Franklin to observe how wars were perceived by those not directly involved. In Europe, conflict was often discussed in strategic terms: alliances, balance of power, and long-term advantage. The human cost, while acknowledged, was abstracted by distance. Franklin did not exploit this abstraction. He avoided presenting the war as a spectacle. He spoke of it as a burden undertaken deliberately, with awareness of sacrifice. Franklin's own emotional response to the war was subdued. He did not express hatred toward Britain or celebrate violence. His letters convey concern for stability and outcome, rather than vindication. This tone reflected his belief that wars, even when necessary, represented failures of coordination and understanding. They were sometimes unavoidable, but never desirable. One of Franklin's central challenges was maintaining confidence during periods of uncertainty. Military campaigns rarely proceeded smoothly, supplies ran short, command decisions were questioned. Morale fluctuated. Franklin understood that allies evaluated not only outcomes, but resilience. How a cause endured setbacks mattered as much as how it achieved success. Franklin's long experience with incremental progress served him well. He reminded interlocutors that building institutions and sustaining resistance required time. Quick victories were rare. Persistence, he argued, was a better measure of viability than momentary advantage. This perspective reassured allies accustomed to drawn-out conflicts. Franklin also navigated internal American tensions from afar. Reports of disagreement among colonial leaders reached Europe, sometimes magnified by rumor. Franklin addressed these concerns directly when necessary, emphasizing shared interests and institutional continuity. He did not deny disagreements. He framed them as manageable within emerging structures. Distance sharpened Franklin's appreciation for unity. He recognized how fragile cohesion could be under strain. From abroad, internal disputes appeared particularly dangerous, as they invited external doubt. Franklin encouraged compromise and patience in his correspondence, reinforcing the idea that internal stability was as critical as external support. The war also raised questions about the future shape of American society. Franklin thought carefully about what independence would require beyond military success. Governance, economic stability, and international relations all demanded attention. War, he understood, was only one phase of a longer process. Franklin's diplomatic responsibilities continued alongside his efforts to interpret the war. He managed ongoing negotiations, coordinated aid, and responded to shifting political landscapes. These tasks required sustained attention and adaptability. Franklin did not allow military developments alone to dictate diplomatic posture. He maintained focus on long-term relationships. French involvement deepened over time, bringing both opportunity and complexity. Support increased, but expectations grew as well. Franklin worked to align military cooperation with political goals. He emphasized coordination and mutual respect, avoiding dependence that might compromise future autonomy. Franklin's scientific background influenced his approach to wartime information. He treated reports as data points requiring verification. He avoided drawing sweeping conclusions from limited evidence. This restraint sometimes frustrated those seeking clear declarations. Franklin accepted this frustration as a necessary cost of accuracy. The personal toll of distance was real. Franklin was separated from familiar places and routines. He received news of losses and hardships without the ability to respond directly. He acknowledged these constraints privately, but did not allow them to dominate his public demeanor. His composure reassured others, even when circumstances were difficult. Franklin's interactions with European intellectuals during the war years also shaped perception. He explained the American cause in practical terms, emphasizing governance, rights, and responsibility rather than ideology alone. This explanation appealed to those interested in reform, grounded in experience rather than theory. The war years reinforced Franklin's belief in moderation. Extremes, he observed, often undermined credibility. Overconfidence invited disappointment. Despair invited abandonment. Franklin sought a middle path that acknowledged difficulty while sustaining resolve. As the conflict progressed, Franklin witnessed shifts in European attitudes. Skepticism gave way to cautious support, then to open recognition. These changes did not occur suddenly. They resulted from accumulated evidence of endurance and organization. Franklin's consistent messaging contributed to this gradual shift. Franklin remained aware that war distorted perception. Events were magnified, emotions heightened, and narratives simplified. He worked against these tendencies by emphasizing continuity and process. He reminded listeners that the American effort was not a single moment, but an extended undertaking. The conclusion of hostilities approached gradually, marked by negotiation rather than sudden resolution. Franklin participated in discussions aimed at defining peace and recognition. These talks required the same patience and clarity that had characterized his wartime diplomacy. Franklin understood that the terms of peace would shape the future as much as victory itself. Throughout this period, Franklin's role remained consistent. He did not command armies or draft strategies. He translated, explained, reassured, and coordinated. His influence lay in maintaining coherence across distance and uncertainty. By the time the war neared its end, Franklin had spent years interpreting events from afar. This perspective gave him a broad view of the conflict's meaning and consequences. He saw how endurance, cooperation, and institutional development mattered as much as battlefield success. The war seen from abroad confirmed for Franklin that independence was not merely declared or won. It was sustained through credibility, patience, and the ability to manage uncertainty. These lessons would inform his work in the years that followed, as the task shifted from securing recognition to building durable structures at home. Franklin's experience during the war underscored the importance of calm persistence. Distance did not diminish responsibility, it required different forms of attention. By maintaining clarity and restraint amid uncertainty, Franklin helped guide the American cause through one of its most demanding phases: return to a changing nation. When Benjamin Franklin finally returned to America after years abroad, he came home to a country that was familiar in outline, yet altered in substance. Independence had been secured in principle, but its meaning was still unsettled in practice. The nation Franklin encountered was not a finished creation. It was a process in motion, shaped by recent conflict, uneven recovery, and competing expectations. For a man whose habits favored careful construction over dramatic declaration, this environment presented both challenge and opportunity. Franklin arrived older, physically diminished in some respects, yet mentally alert. Years of diplomacy had taught him to read between formal statements and practical realities. He carried this skill back with him, attentive to what was being said publicly and what was unfolding quietly beneath it. Celebrations of independence coexisted with uncertainty. Gratitude for peace mingled with anxiety about governance, finance, and cohesion. The immediate atmosphere reflected exhaustion. War had strained resources, disrupted trade, and left institutions fragile. Local governments struggled with debt and administration. Former soldiers sought reintegration. Merchants faced uncertain markets. Franklin observed these conditions without surprise. He had anticipated them. Independence, he believed, was only the removal of an external framework. What followed required deliberate construction. Franklin's reputation preceded him. He was greeted with respect and expectation. Many saw him as a symbol of continuity between the colonial past and the independent present. Franklin accepted this role cautiously. Symbols, he knew, simplified reality. He preferred to be useful rather than emblematic. His first priority was understanding conditions on the ground. He listened extensively, meeting with civic leaders, merchants, and ordinary citizens. He compared their concerns, noting recurring themes: fear of instability, disagreement over authority, and uncertainty about economic direction. These were not abstract worries, they shaped daily decisions and behavior. Franklin did not offer immediate solutions. He asked questions. He encouraged clarification of goals. His approach reflected his belief that durable arrangements required shared understanding before formal design. Rushing to structure without consensus risked building institutions misaligned with public expectation. One of Franklin's central observations was the unevenness of experience across regions. States differed in resources, population, and political culture. Measures that suited one area proved problematic in another. Franklin resisted calls for uniform solutions imposed rapidly. He favored frameworks flexible enough to accommodate diversity while maintaining coherence. Franklin's role in public life resumed quickly, though he did not seek prominence. He accepted responsibilities that allowed him to contribute without dominating. His focus was on process rather than policy detail. He encouraged clarity in procedures, transparency in decision-making, and restraint in enforcement. The absence of a strong central authority created challenges Franklin had long anticipated. Coordination between states was inconsistent. Agreements were difficult to enforce. Franklin understood the attraction of local autonomy, but he also recognized its limits. Without shared mechanisms, collective action faltered. At the same time, Franklin was wary of replacing distant authority with concentrated domestic power. His experiences in London had sharpened his sensitivity to hierarchical rigidity. He believed that new institutions needed to balance effectiveness with accountability. Authority, once established, tended to defend itself. Safeguards mattered. Franklin's age and experience gave him perspective. He had lived through multiple phases of colonial development, conflict, and reform. He knew that institutions evolved over time. He cautioned against expecting immediate perfection. Patience, he argued, was not complacency, it was an acknowledgement of complexity. Public discourse during this period was intense. Pamphlets circulated rapidly, opinions hardened quickly. Franklin observed with concern how simplified narratives spread. Independence had energized public participation, but it had also reduced tolerance for ambiguity. Franklin believed that ambiguity, when acknowledged honestly, allowed adjustment. When denied, it fueled conflict. He continued to write and correspond, though less prolifically than in earlier years. His tone remained measured. He emphasized compromise, shared responsibility, and the importance of learning from error. He avoided aligning himself with extreme positions, even when pressured. Franklin's health imposed constraints. Physical discomfort limited travel and endurance. He adapted by delegating and prioritizing. He focused on matters where his experience was most relevant. This selectivity preserved effectiveness and reduced strain. Economically, Franklin observed the fragility of the post-war period. Debt weighed heavily on governments. Currency issues complicated trade. Franklin encouraged pragmatic measures rather than ideological solutions. Stability, he believed, depended on confidence built through predictable policy. Franklin's international perspective also informed his views. He understood how other nations perceived the new republic. Recognition carried expectations. Instability would invite intervention or exploitation. Franklin emphasized the importance of demonstrating reliability through governance, not rhetoric. Socially, the nation was redefining itself. Old hierarchies weakened. New claims to participation emerged. Franklin welcomed broader involvement, but he also stressed the need for competence. Participation without preparation risked inefficiency. Education and civic habit mattered. Franklin's lifelong commitment to improvement resurfaced here. He supported educational initiatives that prepared citizens for participation in governance and commerce. Knowledge, he believed, was the foundation of self-rule. Without it, independence remained vulnerable. Franklin's interactions with younger leaders were characterized by respect rather than instruction. He did not present himself as an authority issuing directives. He offered perspective drawn from experience. He listened to new ideas attentively, weighing them against observed outcomes rather than dismissing them on principle. Disagreements were frequent and sometimes sharp. Franklin responded with patience. He sought areas of overlap and encouraged incremental agreement. His method was familiar: identify shared interests, clarify differences, and propose trials rather than final solutions. Franklin's belief in voluntary cooperation persisted, though he recognized its limits. Where coordination failed repeatedly, stronger mechanisms were necessary. The challenge lay in designing these mechanisms without reproducing the rigidity of imperial rule. This balance preoccupied him. As discussions turned toward constitutional reform, Franklin watched closely. He recognized both the necessity and the risk. A stronger framework was needed to manage collective action, yet the process of creating it required care to avoid alienation. Franklin did not dominate these discussions. He contributed selectively, emphasizing tone and procedure. He urged respect among participants and cautioned against treating disagreement as disloyalty. He believed that sustainable institutions emerged from compromise rather than victory. The nation Franklin returned to was learning how to argue as a polity. The skills required differed from those of resistance. Franklin understood this transition. He reminded others that opposition and governance demanded different habits. What united people against an external power might divide them internally if left unchecked. Franklin's own demeanor modeled this shift. He was calm, deliberate, and attentive. He avoided personal attacks and discouraged them in others. He understood that trust, once lost, was difficult to restore. As months passed, Franklin observed gradual progress. Institutions stabilized incrementally. Agreements were reached imperfectly but functionally. He took quiet satisfaction in these developments, recognizing them as signs of maturation rather than triumph. Franklin's return marked a transition in his life as well. He moved from diplomacy abroad to consolidation at home. The scale of his work changed, but the principles remained consistent. Observation, clarity, patience, and restraint guided his actions. He did not expect to see all problems resolved in his lifetime. This acceptance freed him from urgency and allowed focus on durability. Franklin's aim was not to shape outcomes directly, but to influence the process by which outcomes were reached. By the end of this period, Franklin had re-established himself within the nation he had helped bring into existence. He was neither architect nor commander. He was a stabilizing presence, attentive to structure and tone. The nation remained incomplete, but it was learning. Franklin's return underscored a central lesson of his life, that beginnings were often easier than continuations. Independence had been declared and defended. Now it had to be lived. The work ahead would be less dramatic, but no less important. Franklin was prepared to contribute to that work in the only way he knew: quietly, carefully, and with an eye toward lasting function: constitutional balance. As the young nation moved deeper into its post-war years, the question that increasingly occupied Benjamin Franklin's attention was not whether independence had been justified, but how it could be sustained without replicating the very problems it had sought to escape. The period leading into the Constitutional Convention confronted Americans with a difficult truth. Unity achieved in opposition did not automatically translate into effective governance. Franklin had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Now, in his 80s, he found himself once again positioned at the intersection of competing impulses: liberty and order, local autonomy, and collective responsibility. The existing framework of governance was proving insufficient. Coordination between states remained uneven. Financial obligations went unmet. Disputes lingered without resolution. Franklin did not interpret these problems as evidence of failure, but as indicators of structural weakness. Systems, he believed, revealed their limitations through stress. The question was not whether reform was necessary, but how far it should extend. Franklin approached the prospect of constitutional revision with characteristic caution. He understood that calls for stronger authority often arose from frustration rather than reflection. Yet he also recognized that persistent inefficiency eroded confidence. The challenge lay in designing institutions capable of action without becoming detached from those they served. When delegates gathered to address these issues, Franklin participated despite physical frailty. His health limited his ability to speak at length, but his presence carried weight. He had lived through colonial administration, imperial breakdown, revolution, and diplomacy. His experience spanned systems and scales. He brought to the convention not a rigid plan, but a perspective shaped by long observation. Franklin's contributions during this period focused less on drafting specific clauses and more on guiding the process. He paid close attention to tone. He observed how quickly disagreement hardened into suspicion. He recognized familiar patterns. Factions defending positions as identities rather than proposals, compromise mistaken for weakness, and urgency overriding deliberation. Franklin intervened selectively. When debates grew heated, he reminded participants of shared goals. He cautioned against assuming perfect foresight. Constitutions, he argued, were instruments of practice, not declarations of certainty. They required adaptability and humility. One of Franklin's most persistent concerns involved balance. He believed that concentration of power, whether in a monarch or an assembly, invited abuse over time. Yet fragmentation of authority invited paralysis. The solution, in his view, was not to eliminate power, but to distribute it thoughtfully, with mechanisms that encouraged cooperation and correction. Franklin supported a stronger central framework than had previously existed, but he resisted extremes. He advocated for structures that could act decisively in matters of common concern, while leaving room for local variation. This stance reflected his lifelong preference for flexibility over rigidity. Representation was another area where Franklin's experience informed his views. He understood the tension between populous and smaller states, between equality and proportionality. Rather than framing the issue as a moral contest, he treated it as a practical problem. Systems needed to be perceived as fair to endure. Perception mattered as much as arithmetic. Franklin encouraged compromise not because it satisfied everyone, but because it preserved cooperation. He reminded delegates that no arrangement would perfectly reflect every interest. Endurance required acceptance of partial satisfaction. This perspective was shaped by decades of civic and diplomatic negotiation. Franklin's remarks during the convention often emphasized fallibility. He acknowledged that even well-designed systems could produce unintended consequences. This acknowledgement was not pessimism. It was preparation. By admitting uncertainty, institutions could be designed with mechanisms for adjustment. Religion and morality entered discussions as well. Franklin believed that ethical behavior supported governance, but he resisted embedding specific doctrines into political structure. His experiences in diverse communities had taught him that shared practice mattered more than shared belief. He favored broad principles over narrow prescriptions. Franklin also emphasized the importance of process. How decisions were made mattered as much as what decisions were reached. Procedures that encouraged deliberation, transparency, and accountability reduced the risk of domination. Franklin believed that good process mitigated bad actors better than idealized assumptions about virtue. His age lent his words a particular resonance. He did not speak as someone seeking future advantage. He spoke as someone conscious of legacy, though not in a personal sense. He was concerned with the habits institutions would cultivate over time. Habits, he knew, often outlasted intentions. Franklin's physical limitations required adaptation. Others often read his remarks aloud. He listened attentively, intervening when necessary. This listening was not passive. He absorbed arguments, tracked shifts, and identified moments when perspective could reframe debate. The atmosphere of the convention was tense but productive. Disagreements were real and sometimes sharp. Franklin's presence helped temper extremes. He did not resolve conflicts single-handedly, but he influenced how they were approached. His calm demeanor reminded others that disagreement need not imply hostility. Franklin's belief in incremental improvement guided his expectations. He did not expect the Constitution to be perfect, he expected it to function. He believed that experience would reveal flaws and that future generations would revise accordingly. This belief contrasted with those who sought finality. Franklin knew that finality in human affairs was an illusion. When the document neared completion, Franklin supported its adoption despite reservations. He recognized imperfections. He acknowledged risks. Yet he judged that the framework offered the best available balance between authority and liberty. In this judgment, he applied the same criteria he had used throughout his life: practicality, adaptability, and shared commitment. Franklin's endorsement carried weight precisely because it was measured. He did not claim certainty. He expressed hope grounded in experience. He emphasized the importance of good faith in implementation. No constitution, he believed, could compensate for persistent bad faith. Conversely, good faith could mitigate structural flaws. Public reaction to the proposed constitution was mixed. Debate continued beyond the convention. Franklin did not engage in polemic. He trusted the process of discussion. He believed that openness and participation strengthened legitimacy. Franklin's role in this phase of nation-building was consistent with his lifelong pattern. He did not seek to dominate outcomes. He shaped conditions for cooperation. He recognized limits and worked within them. His influence was real but understated. The constitutional moment represented a culmination of Franklin's thinking about governance. Ideas formed through printing, civic organization, scientific inquiry, and diplomacy converged here. Balance, process, restraint, and adaptability were not abstract ideals. They were tools refined through practice. As the Constitution moved toward ratification, Franklin withdrew gradually from active debate. His health demanded rest. He trusted others to carry forward the work. This trust was not blind. It reflected his belief that institutions needed to function beyond individuals. Franklin's acceptance of imperfection marked a final maturation of his political philosophy. He no longer sought solutions that resolved tension completely. He sought arrangements that managed tension productively. This distinction mattered. It separated durable systems from brittle ones. By the end of this period, Franklin had contributed to shaping a framework that reflected his deepest convictions without bearing his name. He left no singular imprint easily traced. His influence lay in tone, balance, and process. These contributions were harder to measure but essential. The Constitution, like all human creations, would be tested. Franklin understood this. He did not expect permanence without effort. He expected vigilance, participation, and revision. This expectation aligned with his lifelong commitment to improvement. As Franklin stepped back from public life, he did so with a sense of completion rather than closure. The work of governance would continue without him. He had helped establish conditions under which that work could proceed. For Franklin, this was enough. Private life, public legacy. In the final phase of Benjamin Franklin's life, the balance between public responsibility and private reflection shifted steadily toward the latter. This transition did not occur because Franklin lost interest in civic affairs, nor because his sense of duty diminished. It occurred because age, experience, and physical limitation imposed a narrowing of focus. What remained was not withdrawal, but consolidation, a careful attention to what endured beyond immediate action. Franklin's health had declined gradually over many years. Gout, fatigue, and chronic discomfort limited his mobility and stamina. These conditions were not sudden, nor were they treated with complaint. Franklin accepted them as facts to be managed. He adjusted his routines, delegated responsibilities, and conserved energy. This practical response reflected the same discipline he had applied throughout his life. Limitations were not reasons to disengage entirely. They were signals to adapt. Private life took on greater prominence during this period. Though Franklin never retreated into isolation, he spent more time at home, reading, corresponding, and reflecting. His household became a place of quiet continuity rather than social display. Visitors still came, but interactions were measured. Franklin valued conversation that clarified rather than stimulated. Excess no longer appealed. Family relationships occupied more of his attention. These relationships were complex and sometimes strained, shaped by long absences, differing expectations, and the pressures of public life. Franklin did not idealize family harmony. He understood that closeness did not guarantee agreement. His approach remained consistent. Patience, honesty, and a willingness to accept unresolved tension without allowing it to dominate. Franklin's correspondence during this period offers insight into his private thinking. Letters continued to address public matters, but they increasingly reflected reflection rather than intervention. He commented on developments with a long view, noting patterns rather than outcomes. His tone was calm, occasionally wry, and rarely urgent. Writing remained central to Franklin's daily life. He revised earlier works, clarified ideas, and recorded observations. These writings were not intended as grand statements. They were attempts to preserve useful insight. Franklin had never been drawn to autobiography as self-celebration. When he reflected on his own life, he did so with restraint, emphasizing habit and circumstance over achievement. Franklin's reflections often returned to the theme of improvement. He remained convinced that progress depended less on exceptional individuals than on ordinary habits practiced consistently. This belief shaped his understanding of legacy. He did not measure impact through monuments or titles. He measured it through continuity of practice. Public legacy, in Franklin's view, was not something to be declared. It emerged from how ideas and institutions functioned after their originators were gone. He watched with interest how initiatives he had supported evolved under new leadership. Some adapted well, others faltered. Franklin accepted both outcomes without bitterness. Change, he believed, was inherent to living systems. Franklin's role in public life during these years was advisory rather than directive. Younger leaders sought his perspective. He offered it freely, but without insistence. He understood that authority derived from relevance as much as experience. When advice was accepted, he supported implementation quietly. When it was not, he did not press. This restraint reflected a deep respect for generational transition. Franklin believed that each generation faced conditions distinct enough to require its own judgments. Experience could inform, but not replace, engagement with present reality. He resisted the temptation to frame the past as superior or the future as decline. Franklin's scientific interests remained, though active experimentation diminished. He followed developments through correspondence and reading. He took satisfaction in seeing inquiry continue beyond his own contributions. Science, he believed, progressed through accumulation rather than individual brilliance. His role had been to add a small piece to a larger structure. Intellectual curiosity did not fade with age. Franklin continued to read widely, including history, philosophy, and practical treatises. He remained attentive to how ideas shaped behavior. His reading was not escapist. It was connected to ongoing observation of society. Franklin's private habits reflected continuity. He maintained routines that balanced attention and rest. He valued regularity not as rigidity, but as support. Predictable structure reduced strain and preserved clarity. These habits had sustained him through decades of varied responsibility. They remained effective in later life. Visitors often remarked on Franklin's demeanor during this period. He was calm, attentive, and unpretentious. He did not recount achievements unless asked, and even then, he framed them as collective efforts. This modesty was not performative, it reflected genuine perspective. Franklin had seen enough change to know that prominence was temporary. Franklin's understanding of public legacy also included acceptance of reinterpretation. He knew that future generations would view his actions through lenses shaped by their own concerns. He did not attempt to control these interpretations. He believed that attempts to fix meaning often obscured complexity. One area where Franklin's private convictions remained strong was education. He continued to support educational initiatives, believing them essential to the health of the Republic. Education, in his view, was not merely the transmission of knowledge, it was the cultivation of judgment, patience, and cooperation. Franklin's concern for civic habit persisted. He worried that enthusiasm for independence might fade into complacency. He believed that self-government required ongoing attention and effort. Freedom, he thought, was not a static condition. It had to be practiced. Despite declining health, Franklin remained engaged with public correspondence. He responded to inquiries thoughtfully, even when energy was limited. He chose responses carefully, focusing on clarity and usefulness. He avoided polemics and discouraged polarization. Franklin's attitude toward death during this period was pragmatic. He did not dwell on it, nor did he deny its approach. He treated it as another fact to be acknowledged. This acceptance allowed him to focus on present activity rather than anticipation. He arranged his affairs with care, ensuring continuity and minimizing burden on others. The relationship between Franklin's private life and public legacy was not oppositional. They informed each other, Private reflection sharpened public judgment, public experience enriched private understanding. This integration had characterized Franklin's life from the beginning. Franklin's sense of satisfaction in these years was subdued. He did not express triumph or regret. He recognized that outcomes were mixed. Progress coexisted with unresolved challenges. This recognition did not trouble him. He believed that completeness was not a human condition. His reflections on his own life avoided moral accounting. He did not present himself as an example to be imitated wholesale. He offered habits and observations rather than prescriptions. Readers and correspondents were invited to adapt rather than emulate. Franklin's writing during this period often emphasized humility. He acknowledged error openly. He noted how often conclusions had changed with experience. This openness reinforced his belief that certainty was provisional. Public ceremonies and honors occurred, but Franklin did not seek them. He attended when appropriate, declined when not. He preferred quiet acknowledgement to formal display. His relationship to recognition remained consistent to the end. As his involvement in public affairs diminished, Franklin trusted institutions to function without him. This trust was not naive, it was a deliberate relinquishment. He understood that dependence on individuals weakened systems. By stepping back, he allowed others to assume responsibility. Franklin's final years illustrate a rare form of leadership, the willingness to recede without resentment. He did not cling to influence, he allowed it to disperse. This choice reflected confidence in the processes he had helped shape. Private life, for Franklin, did not mean disengagement from meaning. It meant a shift in scale. Attention moved from coordination to reflection, from initiative to interpretation. This shift was not loss, it was completion. By the end of this period, Franklin had accepted that his direct contributions were concluding. What remained was continuity habits, institutions, and perspectives that would persist independently. This acceptance brought a quiet sense of coherence rather than closure. Franklin's life had never been organized around dramatic endings. It had unfolded through transitions managed with care. The movement from public engagement to private reflection followed the same pattern. There was no rupture, only adjustment. This phase of Franklin's life underscores the connection between private habit and public legacy. His influence endured not because of what he claimed, but because of how he lived. Consistency, restraint, and attention shaped both domains. As he moved toward the end of his life, Franklin remained attentive, reflective, and grounded. The public figure and the private individual had never been separate. They were expressions of the same discipline applied at different scales. The last years of service. In the closing years of Benjamin Franklin's life, service did not disappear. It changed form. The energy that once carried him across oceans and into prolonged debate was no longer available in the same measure. What remained was judgment refined by time, attention sharpened by limitation, and a steady willingness to contribute where contribution still mattered. Franklin's final years were not marked by withdrawal from responsibility, but by a narrowing of focus toward the essential. Physical decline shaped daily decisions. Pain and fatigue imposed boundaries that Franklin respected. He did not treat endurance as a virtue in itself. He believed effectiveness depended on working within limits, not defying them. As a result, he became increasingly selective. He chose tasks where his experience could clarify direction rather than execute detail. This selectivity was not abdication, it was prioritization. Franklin's public role during these years centered largely on counsel. He listened, reflected, and offered perspective when asked. His advice did not take the form of instruction. It emerged as observation grounded in experience. He framed suggestions as possibilities rather than mandates, aware that circumstances had shifted and that authority now rested with others. One of Franklin's enduring concerns was cohesion. The new nation faced pressures that differed from those of revolution. External threats had receded, but internal divisions had surfaced more clearly. Regional interests competed. Economic pressures strained patience. Franklin recognized these dynamics as natural, yet potentially destabilizing if unmanaged. He emphasized the importance of procedure and habit. Disagreement, he believed, was inevitable. What mattered was how disagreement was conducted. Respectful process preserved legitimacy. Procedural fairness reduced the likelihood that conflict would harden into mistrust. Franklin had seen how quickly distrust undermined institutions. He urged vigilance against it. Franklin's correspondence from this period reflects a careful balance between engagement and restraint. He responded to letters thoughtfully, but not exhaustively. He avoided becoming a clearinghouse for grievances. Instead, he encouraged local resolution and institutional pathways. This approach reinforced decentralization without fragmentation. Education remained a central theme in his thinking. Franklin believed that the sustainability of self-government depended on informed participation. He supported efforts to expand access to practical education and continued to emphasize the role of knowledge in shaping judgment. Education, for Franklin, was not about cultivating elites. It was about equipping citizens to manage complexity. Franklin also remained attentive to international relations. He understood that recognition carried ongoing responsibility. Treaties and alliances required maintenance. Reputation mattered. He encouraged consistency in foreign policy and cautioned against impulsive shifts driven by short-term advantage. Stability, he believed, was earned through predictability. The question of slavery occupied a significant place in Franklin's final public engagements. His views had evolved over time, shaped by observation and reflection. In his later years, he lent his support to efforts aimed at limiting and ultimately ending the practice. His approach remained consistent with his temperament, measured, procedural, and focused on gradual change. Franklin understood that moral progress, like institutional progress, required persistence. He did not frame the issue as a test of purity. He framed it as a matter of justice and practicality. A society that tolerated contradiction between principle and practice, he believed, weakened itself. Franklin's involvement in these efforts was careful. He did not claim moral authority beyond his willingness to support action. He acknowledged complexity and resistance. He believed that progress, though slow, depended on sustained attention rather than episodic fervor. Throughout these years, Franklin's demeanor remained calm. He did not display anxiety about legacy or posterity. He did not seek to resolve every issue before his death. He accepted that continuity required work by those who followed. This acceptance allowed him to focus on contributing where contribution was still effective. Franklin's writing during this period retained clarity and restraint. He avoided dramatic appeals. He relied on reasoned argument and observation. His tone suggested confidence in process rather than outcome. This confidence was not naive. It reflected a belief that systems improved through practice. Visitors continued to seek Franklin's presence. Some came out of respect, others sought validation. Franklin met these encounters with patience. He listened carefully, offered perspective, and refrained from endorsing positions without reflection. He understood the responsibility attached to his reputation. Franklin's daily routines adapted to his condition. He structured days around limited periods of activity, interspersed with rest. Reading and correspondence filled much of his time. These activities allowed engagement without physical strain. They also provided continuity with habits established long ago. Despite physical discomfort, Franklin's intellectual curiosity remained intact. He followed developments in science, politics, and society. He noted patterns and trends. His reflections were less concerned with novelty than with implication. He asked how changes affected stability, cooperation, and fairness. Franklin's humor, subdued but present, emerged occasionally in private remarks. It was not biting or dismissive. It reflected perspective rather than superiority. Humor, for Franklin, served to soften rigidity and remind listeners of shared humanity. One of Franklin's strengths in these years was his ability to model acceptance without resignation. He acknowledged decline without self-pity. He continued to contribute without clinging. This balance influenced those around him. It demonstrated that service was not synonymous with control. Franklin's interactions with younger leaders were marked by mutual respect. He did not assume that experience guaranteed correctness. He recognized that new conditions required new approaches. His advice aimed to inform rather than constrain. He encouraged experimentation within bounds of responsibility. Franklin's concern for institutional resilience persisted. He observed how quickly informal arrangements could erode without reinforcement. He urged attention to maintenance. Laws, procedures, and norms required ongoing care. Neglect, he believed, invited decay. Financial matters also drew his attention. The nation faced ongoing fiscal challenges. Franklin advocated prudence and transparency. He believed that public trust depended on visible accountability. Fiscal discipline, in his view, was not merely economic, it was civic. Franklin's understanding of time had changed. He no longer measured progress by immediate outcome. He thought in terms of trajectory. Was the nation learning? Were institutions adapting? Were habits improving? These questions mattered more than temporary success or failure. As Franklin approached the end of his life, he did not withdraw into retrospection. He did not recount his achievements extensively. He focused on present activity and future implication. This orientation reflected his lifelong emphasis on usefulness. His final public acts were consistent with this emphasis. They addressed ongoing issues without seeking resolution through authority. Franklin did not attempt to settle debates conclusively. He aimed to nudge processes toward fairness and stability. Franklin's private acceptance of mortality shaped his public demeanor subtly. He was less reactive, less invested in immediate disputes. This detachment did not indicate disinterest, it indicated proportion. He weighed issues against the long arc of institutional development. Family relationships remained part of his attention, though they carried complexity. Franklin did not idealize reconciliation. He valued honesty and continuity over forced harmony. He believed that respect could persist even when agreement did not. Franklin's final correspondence often returned to themes of moderation and patience. He cautioned against extremes and urged attention to process. His voice was steady, informed by experience rather than urgency. As physical strength declined further, Franklin accepted increased dependence on others. He did so without embarrassment. He recognized interdependence as a constant in human affairs. Independence, he believed, did not mean isolation. It meant capacity to cooperate without coercion. The last years of Franklin's service were quiet but consequential. He demonstrated that contribution did not require prominence. Influence could persist through tone, counsel, and example. By remaining engaged without dominating, he reinforced the habits he believed essential to self-government. Franklin's life had spanned eras of colonial dependency, imperial conflict, revolution, and nation-building. In his final years, he embodied continuity across these transitions. He did not seek to define meaning. He allowed it to emerge through practice. The calm that characterized Franklin's last years was not the absence of concern. It was the presence of proportion. He understood what could be influenced and what could not. This understanding guided his remaining efforts. As he approached death, Franklin's focus remained outward rather than inward. He did not seek closure through self-assessment. He sought it through ensuring that work continued without him. This orientation reflected his deepest conviction that improvement was collective and ongoing. The last years of service were thus not an epilogue detached from the rest of his life. They were a continuation adjusted to circumstance. The same principles, clarity, restraint, patience, and usefulness remained in force. Franklin did not depart public life dramatically. He faded from it gradually, as health required and time dictated. This gradual withdrawal mirrored his approach to progress itself, incremental, attentive, and grounded. By the time Franklin's direct involvement concluded, he had left behind more than accomplishments. He had left habits of engagement that others could adopt. These habits would matter long after his voice fell silent. A quiet, enduring presence. Benjamin Franklin's final months did not announce themselves with ceremony. They unfolded as his life had long unfolded, through adjustment rather than rupture, through attention rather than display. By this point, his public presence had receded, not because it was rejected, but because it had completed its work. What remained was not absence, but an enduring presence embedded in habits, institutions, and ways of thinking that continued without him. Franklin's physical condition deteriorated steadily. Pain was frequent, movement limited, and rest increasingly necessary. Yet his mind remained attentive. He continued to read when able, to listen when visitors came, and to respond thoughtfully when correspondence reached him. These activities were paced carefully, chosen not for obligation but for usefulness. He no longer attempted to keep up with every development, he trusted that others would do so. His household during this time reflected quiet continuity. Daily routines were simple and predictable. Assistance was accepted without resistance. Franklin had long understood that independence did not mean self-sufficiency at all times. It meant the capacity to cooperate without humiliation or domination. Accepting care was part of that understanding. Franklin's final reflections, shared privately rather than proclaimed publicly, returned often to proportion. He believed that much human conflict arose from misjudging scale, treating temporary disagreements as permanent divisions, or elevating personal conviction above shared function. His long life had taught him that endurance depended on recalibration. Systems survived when they adjusted. He did not attempt to shape how he would be remembered. This restraint was deliberate. Franklin believed that efforts to control legacy often obscured complexity. He accepted that future generations would interpret his life through their own concerns. This acceptance freed him from anxiety about reputation. Franklin's last public concerns centered on continuity. He wanted institutions to function without reliance on individuals. He believed that durability required distributed responsibility. This belief had guided his work from the earliest days of civic organization through diplomacy and constitutional design. It remained central at the end. Those who visited Franklin in his final period often remarked on his calm. It was not the calm of detachment, but of familiarity. He had lived through enough change to recognize patterns, rise and decline, conflict and resolution, enthusiasm and disappointment. These cycles no longer surprised him. He did not minimize their importance. He contextualized them. Franklin's conversations in these months were reflective rather than directive. He asked questions that encouraged others to think rather than instructing them how to act. He listened carefully, offering perspective when it clarified rather than compelled. This manner reflected trust in process and people. His writings during this time were sparse but deliberate. When he wrote, he aimed to clarify rather than persuade. He avoided embellishment. His sentences were measured, shaped by decades of discipline. The goal was not to impress, but to preserve usefulness. Franklin's attitude toward death was pragmatic. He did not dramatize it, nor did he deny it. He viewed it as another transition final, but not mysterious. This acceptance allowed him to focus on present engagement rather than anticipation. He arranged his affairs methodically, reducing uncertainty for those who followed. In these final arrangements, Franklin's values were evident. He avoided extravagance. He emphasized fairness and clarity. He sought to minimize burden. These choices reflected his belief that even private decisions had public implications. How one exited mattered to those who remained. Franklin's life had never been organized around singular moments of triumph. It had been a sequence of adjustments, each informed by observation and restraint. The end followed the same pattern. There was no final declaration, no summary offered for posterity. There was only continuity until continuity was no longer possible. When Franklin died, the response was widespread but measured. Recognition came from many quarters, reflecting the breadth of his influence. Yet the nature of that influence resisted simple categorization. He was remembered not for a single role, but for a way of engaging with the world. Franklin's enduring presence lay in habits more than achievements. The habit of asking whether something worked, the habit of listening before speaking, the habit of accepting imperfection without surrendering effort. These habits were transferable. They did not depend on genius or circumstance. They depended on attention. Institutions Franklin had helped shape continued to evolve. Some thrived, others struggled. This variability did not diminish his contribution. He had never believed that success guaranteed permanence. He believed that structures provided possibilities, not outcomes. Their fate depended on ongoing practice. Franklin's scientific contributions persisted through method rather than theory. Observation, testing, and openness to correction remained central to inquiry. His civic contributions persisted through voluntary association, procedural clarity, and shared responsibility. His political contributions persisted through balance, compromise, and restraint. None of these required reverence. Franklin would have resisted it. Reverence froze practice into form. He preferred adaptability. He believed that honoring the past meant using it, not preserving it untouched. Franklin's life demonstrated that influence need not be dramatic to be durable. Quiet consistency often traveled further than bold assertion. This lesson was embedded in the structures he left behind. It remained available to those willing to adopt it. As time passed, Franklin's presence became diffuse. His name remained, but more importantly, his approach endured. People continued to build libraries, form associations, test ideas, negotiate differences, and revise institutions. These activities did not require invocation. They were practices integrated into civic life. Franklin's enduring presence also lay in moderation. In times of excess, his example offered counterbalance. In times of paralysis, it offered movement. This flexibility reflected his understanding that no single posture sufficed for all circumstances. The quiet nature of Franklin's influence made it resilient. It did not depend on charisma or authority. It depended on repetition. Each time someone chose clarity over rhetoric, patience over urgency, cooperation over dominance, that influence was renewed. Franklin's life closed without spectacle, but not without completion. The work he had done was not finished, but it was ongoing. That distinction mattered. Completion lay not in resolution, but in continuity. His death marked the end of personal contribution, not the end of effect. The habits he had modeled did not belong to him alone. They were available to any who found them useful. Franklin had lived long enough to see beginnings and consequences. He had learned that most outcomes were provisional. This understanding freed him from the need to judge final meaning. He trusted process to reveal value over time. As we come to the end of this long journey, the pace can slow now. The details no longer need to be held tightly. Franklin's life, with all its movement and adjustment, has settled into a broader pattern, one that does not demand attention, only quiet recognition. You might notice the sense of steadiness that follows, the feeling that things continue even when stories end. Imagine the rooms growing quieter, the correspondence put away, the chair left empty, but the work still happening elsewhere. There is no urgency here, only the calm awareness that effort, once given, does not vanish. It disperses. If your thoughts drift, let them. The rhythms of the story can fade into the background like distant footsteps or a turning page. What remains is a sense of continuity, gentle and unforced. Breathe slowly. Let the day loosen its grip. The world Franklin inhabited has passed, but the habits he practiced still move quietly through the present. You do not need to follow them now. You can rest. The lights can dim a little more. The background hum can take over. Nothing more is required of you tonight.